Helena Crowell stood on that rain-slicked platform, all 6 feet 2 inches of her, watching the man who'd promised to marry her take one look at her height and turn his back forever. 8 months of letters, 8 months of hope, gone in the time it took for Eamon Pike's smile to die. But what that cruel businessman didn't know was that rejection would lead Helena straight into the arms of a man who built his world tall enough to fit her. A timber baron who saw her height not as a flaw, but as magnificence itself. This is the story of the mail-order bride who was rejected for taking up too much space until she found a place built exactly to her measure. Stay with me until the end and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far Helena's story reaches. The Pacific Express hissed and groaned as it pulled into North Lake Station, expelling steam into the gray November air like the breath of some exhausted beast. Helena Crowell pressed her gloved hand against the cold window, watching the logging town materialize through the rain. Wooden buildings huddled against the forest, muddy streets carved between them, and everywhere the massive stumps of ancient trees testament to the industry that fed this frontier settlement. Her heart hammered against her ribs. 8 months. 8 months of letters that had traveled 3,000 miles, carrying words that built a future one sentence at a time. Eamon Pike's penmanship had been elegant, his vocabulary refined. He'd written of North Lake's promise, of the business opportunities in a growing timber town, of the home he was preparing. And in his 5th letter, after Helena had gathered the courage to mention her height, 6 feet 2 inches in her stockings, he had responded with words she'd memorized. My dear Helena, I am a man of modern thinking. What matters is the quality of one's character, not the measurement of one's frame. I look forward to meeting a woman of such unique distinction. Those words had been a lifeline. All her life, Helena had been too much, too tall for the factory work in Philadelphia, too tall for the teaching positions that wanted women who didn't tower over their students, too tall for the suitors who wanted delicate flowers, not sturdy oak trees. At 28, she'd watched younger, shorter women marry and build lives while she remained alone, hemming their wedding dresses and hearing their whispered pity. The mail-order bride service had seemed like madness at first, but desperation has a way of making madness seem reasonable. North Lake Station, the conductor called, his voice muffled by the rain drumming on the train car roof. Final stop! Helena stood, her head nearly brushing the ceiling of the passenger car. She'd worn her best traveling dress, deep burgundy wool with modest black trim, and had pinned her dark hair into a neat bun that added another 2 inches to her height. Her trunk contained everything she owned, 3 more dresses, undergarments, sewing supplies, her mother's Bible, and a cameo brooch that had belonged to her grandmother. Everything she was fit into one trunk. The conductor helped her down the steps, his eyes widening slightly as he realized her height. Helena was used to that look, that moment of recalibration when people's expectations met reality. She stepped onto the platform, rain immediately spotting her shoulders, and scanned the crowd for Eamon Pike. She'd studied his photograph until she could draw his features from memory. Refined features, dark hair parted precisely, a neat beard, and eyes that the photographer's art made seem kind. He'd be wearing a gray suit he'd written in his last letter and carrying a black umbrella. There. Helena's breath caught. Eamon Pike stood at the platform's edge, exactly as described. The photograph hadn't lied. He was handsome in a careful, constructed way. But as she stepped forward, her trunk bumping against her leg, she noticed something the photograph couldn't convey. He was perhaps 5 feet 8 inches tall, not short by any standard measure. But as Helena approached, as she drew close enough to see the exact moment he recognized her from her own photograph, she watched his expression transform. His smile didn't just fade, it died. His eyes traveled up, 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 from her chin to her eyes, a journey that seemed to take years. And in those eyes, Helena saw something worse than surprise. She saw revulsion. She saw humiliation. She saw a man doing rapid calculations about what it would mean to stand beside her in this town, to be known as the man whose wife towered over him. Miss Crowell. His voice was tight, controlled, not the warm tone his letters had carried. Welcome to North Lake. He didn't move to take her hand, didn't step forward. The umbrella stayed firmly over his own head while rain darkened her shoulders. Mr. Pike. Helena forced brightness into her voice, forced herself to believe this was just shock, just surprise, something that would pass once they talked, once he remembered those letters full of promises. It's wonderful to finally— You're very tall. The words came out flat, accusatory. Around them, the platform was emptying. Other passengers were being greeted by family, by friends, being folded into embraces and swept away under shared umbrellas. But Helena stood alone in the rain with a man who looked at her like she was a problem requiring solution. Yes, Helena said carefully. I mentioned that in my letters. I believe I was quite clear about— You said you were tall. Eamon's jaw worked. You didn't say you were a giantess. The word hit like a slap. Helena had been called many things in her 28 years. Tall, certainly. Statuesque, by the generous. Unfortunate, by the cruel. But giantess carried a particular venom, a particular reduction of her humanity to something freakish and strange. Mr. Pike. She kept her voice level, though her hands trembled. Perhaps we should speak somewhere more private. I've traveled a very long way, and this won't work. He said it quickly, like ripping off a bandage. I'm sorry, Miss Crowell, but I cannot— This is not what I expected. I run a business in this town. I have a position to maintain. I cannot have— He gestured vaguely at her height. This. The platform had emptied. Even the conductor had retreated to the shelter of the station house. They stood alone in the rain, and Helena felt the future she'd traveled 3,000 miles toward crumble like wet paper. You wrote to me for 8 months? Her voice barely rose above the sound of the rain. You said character mattered. You said— I know what I wrote. Eamon's face flushed. But I also know what I see. This town talks, Miss Crowell. They'll make me a laughingstock. The man who ordered a bride and got a woman who doesn't fit your idea of proper proportion, Helena finished for him. Something was hardening in her chest, something cold and crystalline. Disappointment, yes. Humiliation, certainly. But underneath, something sharper. Anger. I've already arranged for your return ticket. Eamon reached into his coat pocket, produced an envelope. The eastbound train leaves tomorrow morning. I've reserved you a room at the boarding house for tonight. It's all paid for. He held out the envelope, still not stepping close enough to hand it to her properly. Helena stared at it, at this man who'd written 8 months of beautiful lies, and felt something shift inside her. She'd spent her whole life trying to make herself smaller, more acceptable, less inconvenient, bending, folding, apologizing for the space she occupied. But she'd also crossed an entire continent based on promises this man had made. No. The word came out stronger than she expected. Eamon blinked. I'm sorry? No. Helena straightened to her full height. Rain ran down her face, plastered her hair to her skull, but she didn't flinch. You don't get to summon me across 3,000 miles and then dismiss me like I'm an unsatisfactory piece of furniture. You made promises, Mr. Pike. You created expectations. You can't simply— I can do exactly that. Eamon's voice turned cold. You're not my wife, Miss Crowell. We had no legal contract. I have no obligation to you beyond basic Christian charity, which I'm extending by paying for your room and your return passage. Now take the ticket before I lose my patience entirely. He thrust the envelope toward her. Helena looked at it, at his face, at the empty platform and the strange town beyond and the rain that showed no signs of stopping. She thought about Philadelphia, about the boarding house room she'd given up, about the factory job she'd quit, about the humiliation of returning to face the women who'd pitied her departure. She thought about having nothing, and then she thought about having at least her dignity. Helena took the envelope, but she didn't open it. She simply tucked it into her coat pocket and met Eamon Pike's eyes with a level gaze that made him look away first. Thank you for your charity, Mr. Pike, she said, her voice carrying a weight that made the word charity sound like the insult it was. I'll be sure to remember it. She picked up her trunk, heavy, awkward, loaded with everything she owned, and walked past him toward the station house. Her shoulders were soaked through. Her fingers were numb, but she kept her spine straight and her head high, and she didn't look back to see if he was watching. The station house offered minimal shelter, a wooden structure with a pot-bellied stove that threw off grudging heat and benches worn smooth by waiting travelers. The The clerk behind the window was a thin man with wire spectacles who barely glanced up as Helena entered. "Excuse me," Helena said, setting her trunk down with a thump that made the clerk look up. "I need directions to the boarding house." The clerk's eyes widened slightly at her height, but to his credit, his expression remained professional. "Flint's boarding house, you mean? That's where most folks stay. Head down Main Street, take the left fork at the mill, 3 buildings down. Can't miss it. Mrs. Flint runs a clean establishment." "Thank you." Helena hesitated, then asked, "Is there any other option? Another boarding house, perhaps?" The clerk shook his head. "Not for respectable ladies. There's the timber camp lodgings, but those are for workers only, and the hotel above the saloon, but I wouldn't recommend—" "I understand. Thank you." Helena picked up her trunk again and stepped back into the rain. Main Street was a morass of mud and timber planks laid down as makeshift sidewalks. The buildings crowded close: a general store, a smithy, a sawmill with its blade currently silent, a church with a steeple that looked too grand for the rough buildings around it. Men in work clothes hurried past, heads down against the weather. A wagon loaded with massive logs rolled by, wheels throwing up mud. This was supposed to be her new home. Helena found the boarding house exactly where the clerk had described, a 2-story structure that looked newer than its neighbors, painted a cheerful yellow that seemed absurd in the gray rain. A sign above the door read, "Flint's Boarding House, Clean Rooms, Respectable Tenants Only." Helena climbed the front steps and knocked. The woman who answered was perhaps 50, with iron-gray hair pinned severely back and sharp eyes that swept over Helena in one comprehensive glance. She was short, barely 5 feet tall, and had to crane her neck back to meet Helena's gaze. "Help you?" Her voice was brisk but not unkind. "My name is Helena Crowell. I believe Mr. Eamon Pike arranged a room for me for tonight." Something shifted in the woman's expression. Not quite sympathy, but recognition. "Ah, you're the mail-order bride." The words hung in the air between them. In a town this small, news clearly traveled faster than rain. "I was supposed to be," Helena said quietly. "Now I'm simply a traveler in need of a room." The woman, Mrs. Flint, Helena presumed, studied her for a long moment. Then she stepped back, opening the door wider. "Well, come in out of the rain before you catch your death. I'm Marjorie Flint, and I run this establishment. Pike paid for one night, but we can discuss further arrangements if you need them." The interior of the boarding house was as neat as its exterior promised. Polished wood floors, simple but sturdy furniture, oil lamps casting warm light against the gloom outside. A sitting room opened to the left, where an elderly man dozed in a chair near the fireplace. Stairs climbed to the right. "Your room's on the second floor," Marjorie said, already moving toward the stairs. "I'll help you with that trunk. Lord knows you've had a day of it already." Between the two of them, they managed to haul the trunk up the narrow stairs. Marjorie led Helena to a room at the end of the hall, small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, a chair, and a window that looked out toward the forest beyond town. "Dinner's at 6, Marjorie said, setting down her end of the trunk with a grunt. "Nothing fancy, but it's hot and filling. Breakfast at 7. Outhouse is out back, but there's a chamber pot under the bed if you need it at night. Any questions?" Helena stood in the center of the small room, dripping rainwater onto the floorboards, and felt the full weight of her situation settle onto her shoulders. Tomorrow morning, she was supposed to board a train back to Philadelphia. Back to nothing. "Mrs. Flint," she heard herself say. "What if I wanted to stay longer than one night?" Marjorie's eyebrows rose. "You'd need to pay. $2 a week for room and board, paid in advance." $2. Helena had exactly $17 to her name, enough for 8 weeks if she spent nothing else. And then what? "I'll let you know in the morning," Helena said. Marjorie nodded, then paused at the door. "Miss Crowell? I don't know what Pike told you, and I don't know what you were expecting, but I will say this, Northlake isn't a bad town. Rough, certainly. Full of men who spend too much time in the forest, and not enough in civilized company. But there's decent people here, and a woman with skills can make a life, if she's determined enough." "What kind of skills?" Helena asked. "Can you cook, sew, keep accounts, teach children, nurse the sick?" Marjorie ticked off on her fingers. Any useful skill can be turned to profit in a place like this, if you're willing to work and not too proud to start small. After Marjorie left, Helena stood at the window and stared out at the rain-soaked town. Smoke rose from chimneys, lights glowed in windows. Somewhere out there, Eamon Pike was congratulating himself on his narrow escape from the embarrassment of a too-tall wife. And Helena was alone, again, in a strange place with no plan and diminishing resources. She should take the return ticket. She should go back east, find another factory job, disappear into the anonymous crowds of Philadelphia. It was the sensible thing to do, the safe thing. But Helena Crowell was tired of safe, tired of small, tired of apologizing for existing. She unpacked her sewing kit and spread it on the small table. Needles, thread, scissors, measuring tape, pins. Her mother had taught her to sew, and Helena had discovered she was good at it, better than good. She could look at a body and know instinctively what would flatter it, what would make someone feel beautiful, despite the flaws they saw in themselves. Ironic, since she'd never managed that trick for herself. At 6 o'clock, Helena went downstairs to the dining room. 5 other boarders sat around a long table, 4 men who looked like mill workers, and 1 older woman who introduced herself as Mrs. Talbot, the schoolteacher. They all stared at Helena's height, but Mrs. Talbot recovered first and gestured to an empty seat. "Sit down, dear. Marjorie makes a fine stew, and you look like you need something hot inside you." The meal was simple but good. Beef stew, fresh bread, butter, and coffee, strong enough to strip paint. The conversation flowed around Helena, timber talk mostly. Prices for lumber, the railroad spur being built toward North Lake, the old-growth forest to the north that hadn't been touched yet. And then one of the men, young, with sawdust still in his hair, asked the question Helena had been dreading. "You're Pike's mail-order bride, aren't you? Heard you came in on the train today?" The room went quiet. Helena set down her spoon carefully. "I was supposed to be. Mr. Pike has changed his mind." "Because you're tall?" The young man's face flushed. "Sorry, I shouldn't have." "It's all right," Helena said, though it wasn't. "Yes, because I'm tall." Mrs. Talbot made a disgusted sound. "Eamon Pike is a small man in every way that matters. You're better off without him, Miss Crowell." "Maybe so," Helena said. "But I'm also stranded in a town I know nothing about, with very little money and nowhere to go." The words came out before she could stop them, laying her vulnerability bare before these strangers. But something in her was tired of pretending, tired of maintaining the fiction that everything was fine. "You sew?" Marjorie asked from the doorway to the kitchen. She'd been listening, Helena realized. "Yes, I'm quite skilled, actually." "Prove it." Marjorie disappeared and returned a moment later with a man's shirt, the sleeve torn nearly off. "Fix that so I can't see where it was ripped." Helena examined the tear. It was substantial, running through the seam and into the fabric itself. But it was repairable. She retrieved her sewing kit from upstairs and set to work at the table, conscious of everyone watching. She removed the damaged section, reinforced the seam with careful stitches too small to see, and used a technique called reverse applique to patch the tear with fabric from the shirt's tail, matching the grain precisely. 20 minutes later, she handed the shirt back to Marjorie. The boarding house owner examined it closely, turning it inside out, holding it up to the light. "I'll be damned," she said finally. "Can't tell it was ever torn." "I told you I was skilled." "That you are." Marjorie looked at her thoughtfully. "There's no seamstress in North Lake. The nearest is in Port Clement, 30 miles north. Most folks make do with their own poor stitching or go without. If you wanted to stay, if you wanted to set up shop, I think you'd find customers." Hope flickered in Helena's chest. "I'd need space, equipment, fabric, all things that cost money I don't have." "You could work from your room to start," Marjorie said. "Take in mending, alterations, build up capital. I'd be your first customer. I've got a pile of shirts and trousers that need fixing, and I'd spread the word." "I'll think about it," Helena said. But she was already thinking about it, already calculating, already seeing a possible future that didn't involve crawling back to Philadelphia in defeat. That night, lying in the narrow bed and listening to the rain hammer the roof, Helena made her decision. She would stay. Not forever, perhaps, but long enough to earn enough money to choose her next step from a position of strength rather than desperation. She would stay, and she would not shrink. The next morning dawned gray and cold, but the rain had stopped. Helena rose early, dressed in her second-best dress, dark blue wool with practical buttons, and went downstairs to find Marjorie already in the kitchen, kneading bread dough. "I'd like to stay," Helena said without preamble. "I'll need the room for another week while I establish whether there's enough work to sustain me." Marjorie dusted flour off her hands. $2, paid now. Helena counted out the coins, feeling the diminishment of her small savings. "And I'll fix those clothes you mentioned for $1. 50 cents, Marjorie countered. 75, and I'll have them done by tomorrow." Marjorie grinned. "You'll do just fine here, Miss Crowell. Deal." After breakfast, Helena walked to the general store to return Eamon Pike's train ticket and recover what money she could from it. The store was cramped and cluttered, smelling of tobacco, leather, and coffee beans. The proprietor was a balding man who eyed her height with interest rather than judgment. "Help you, miss?" "I need to return this train ticket and get a refund." He examined the ticket, then shook his head. "Can't give you cash. Company policy. But I can give you store credit for 75% of the value. $3.20 worth of goods." It wasn't ideal, but it was better than nothing. Helena spent an hour carefully selecting what she needed. More thread in various colors, needles, pins, a piece of chalk for marking fabric, and a small pair of scissors sharper than what she currently owned. She spent exactly $3.15, hoarding the remaining 5 cents of credit like treasure. As she was leaving, the proprietor called after her. "Miss, if you're really setting up as a seamstress, I'd be interested in carrying some of your work. Simple things, you understand. Aprons, work shirts, that sort of thing. I'd buy them outright if the quality was good and the price was right." Another possibility. Another thread of hope. Helena returned to the boarding house and set to work on Marjorie's mending pile. There were 12 items in total. Torn shirts, trousers with blown-out seams, a jacket with a broken lining. She worked steadily through the morning and into the afternoon, her needle flashing in the gray light from the window. She'd almost finished the 8th item when she heard heavy footsteps on the stairs. Men's footsteps, but heavier than any she'd heard in the boarding house before. A knock on her door. Helena set down her sewing. "Yes?" "Miss Crowell?" The voice was deep, rumbling like distant thunder. "Mrs. Flint said I might find you here. My name is Marshall Drake. I wonder if I might speak with you for a moment." Helena opened the door and found herself looking up. Looking up. In her entire adult life, Helena could count on one hand the number of times she'd had to tilt her head back to meet someone's eyes. But Marshall Drake was enormous. 6 feet 8 inches at least, broad-shouldered and barrel-chested, with hands that looked like they could snap logs like kindling. He wore working clothes, heavy canvas trousers, a wool shirt, boots caked with mud and sawdust. His face was weathered, tanned from years of outdoor work, with a strong jaw and eyes the color of pine bark. He held his hat in his hands, turning it nervously. "Mr. Drake," Helena said, her voice surprisingly steady despite her shock. "I heard about what happened," Marshall said without preamble. "With Pike. Heard he rejected you on the platform in front of the whole town because of your height." Helena's face burned. "News travels quickly in North Lake. It's a small town, and Pike's been bragging about his good sense in sending you back." Marshall's jaw tightened. "Wanted folks to know he made the smart business decision, I suppose." The humiliation of it struck Helena fresh. Not only had Eamon Pike rejected her, he was using her rejection as a story to tell, a way to demonstrate his cleverness. She was a joke to him, a narrow escape, an amusing anecdote. "Was there something you needed, Mr. Drake?" Helena asked, her voice tight. "I wanted you to know you're not the only tall soul in this town," Marshall said quietly, "and that some of us don't think height is something to be ashamed of." He said it so simply, so matter-of-factly, that Helena felt something crack in her chest. All the tears she'd been holding back, all the hurt and humiliation and rage, suddenly pressed against her control like water against a dam. "Thank you," she managed. "That's very kind of you to say." "Not kind. True." Marshall shifted his weight, making the floorboards creak. "Mrs. Flint mentioned you might be staying in North Lake, setting up as a seamstress." "I'm considering it. I have a business proposition. if you're interested. Marshall glanced down at his massive frame. Finding clothes that fit me is nearly impossible. Most of my shirts I have to order from a specialty tailor in Seattle, and they cost a fortune and take months to arrive. If you could make me work shirts that actually fit, I'd pay you well. And I'd recommend you to my timber crews. Most of them are big men with the same problem. Hope flickered again, stronger this time. I'd need to take your measurements, and I'd need to purchase fabric, which would require payment in advance. How much? Helena did quick calculations. Fabric for a man his size, in canvas or heavy cotton, suitable for timber work. Thread, buttons, her labor. $3 per shirt, paid half in advance. It was more than she'd charge for a normal shirt, but Marshall Drake was far from normal-sized. Done, Marshall said immediately. I'll need 6 to start. Here's $9 advance. He pulled coins from his pocket, counted them carefully into her hand. When can you have the first one ready? Helena stared at the money. $9. Combined with what she'd make from Marjorie's mending, she'd have enough to pay for another month's room and board with money left over for fabric and supplies. 1 week, she said, for the first shirt. The rest will follow as I complete them. Fair enough. Marshall's face broke into a smile that transformed his stern features into something almost gentle. Welcome to Northlake, Miss Crowell. I hope you'll stay a while. After he left, Helena sat down on her bed and counted the money 3 times, making sure it was real. $9, a commission for 6 more shirts, the promise of recommendations to timber crews. Maybe, just maybe, she could make this work. The afternoon faded into evening. Helena finished Marjorie's mending and delivered it to the boarding house owner, who examined each piece with a critical eye before nodding approval and paying the promised 75 cents. Good work, Marjorie said. I'll tell everyone I know. You'll have customers before week's end, I'd wager. That night at dinner, Helena noticed the other boarders looking at her differently. Not with pity or curiosity, but with something like respect, Mrs. Talbot asked if Helena could let out a dress for her. I'm not as slim as I used to be, and I can't bear to give up this particular dress. One of the mill workers wondered if she could patch his good jacket. By the time Helena returned to her room, she had 3 more commissions and had earned another $1 in advance payments. She stood at her window, looking out at Northlake. Somewhere out there, Eamon Pike was probably congratulating himself on dodging a bullet. Somewhere out there was the train station where he'd humiliated her, the platform where he'd looked at her height and seen only embarrassment. But somewhere out there was also Marshall Drake, a man who'd sought her out not despite her height, but because he understood what it meant to be too tall for a world built too small. Helena touched the coins in her pocket. $9 from Marshall, $1 from various boarders, 75 cents from Marjorie. She had nearly $11 now, more than she'd had this morning. She had work to do, shirts to sew, fabric to purchase, a business to build. She had chosen to stay, and she would not apologize for the space she took up. The rain started again as she prepared for bed, drumming on the roof like applause. Helena lay in the darkness, listening to it, and for the first time since stepping off that train, she felt something other than despair. She felt possibility. The first week passed in a blur of needle and thread. Helena woke each morning before dawn, worked through breakfast, and continued until her eyes burned in the lamplight. Her fingers developed new calluses. Her back ached from hunching over her sewing, but with each completed garment, her small hoard of coins grew. Marjorie's mending had been returned to universal satisfaction, leading to a steady stream of boarders and their friends appearing at Helena's door with torn clothing and hopeful expressions. Mrs. Talbot's dress alteration revealed that Helena had an eye not just for repair, but for improvement. She'd suggested taking in the shoulders and adding a small pleat at the waist that transformed a frumpy garment into something almost fashionable. Mrs. Talbot had been so delighted she'd paid an extra 50 cents and shown the dress to half the town. By the end of that first week, Helena had earned enough to pay for another 3 weeks of room and board. More importantly, she'd established herself as someone useful, someone with skills this rough timber town needed. Marshall Drake's first shirt was ready on the 8th day. Helena had spent hours getting the measurements right, cutting the heavy canvas carefully, reinforcing the seams that would take the most stress. She'd made the shoulders broad enough to accommodate his frame, the sleeves long enough to reach his wrists, the body roomy enough for movement without being baggy. She'd even added an extra reinforcement at the elbows where the fabric would wear fastest. When she delivered it to the address he'd given her, a small office near the sawmill with Drake Timber Company painted on the window, Marshall tried it on immediately. He stretched, bent, reached, testing the garment's limits. "Miss Crowell," he said finally, "this is the first shirt I've owned in 5 years that actually fits. How soon can you make the others?" "1 per week," Helena said. "I have other commissions and I want to maintain quality." "Fair enough, and I meant what I said about recommending you to my crews." Marshall pulled a small notebook from his desk, scribbled something, and tore out the page. "These are the names of my 3 foremen. Tell them I sent you, and they'll spread word among the men. Most of them have wives who do the sewing, but for the single men and those whose wives aren't skilled with a needle, you'll find plenty of work." Helena took the paper, studying the names written in Marshall's surprisingly neat handwriting. "Thank you, Mr. Drake. This is very generous." "It's business, Miss Crowell. Good work deserves fair compensation and honest recommendation." Marshall paused, then added, "And please, call me Marshall. Mr. Drake makes me feel like my father, and I spent most of my youth trying not to be like him." "Then you should call me Helena." "Helena." He said her name carefully, as if testing its weight. "There's a town social next Saturday evening. Church basement, nothing fancy. Dancing, refreshments, gossip. I wonder if you'd consider attending, as my guest." Helena's heart stuttered. The invitation was carefully worded. He wasn't asking for courtship, merely companionship at a public event. But the intention behind it was clear enough. Marshall Drake was interested in her, and he wanted others to know it. "People will talk," Helena said carefully, "about my height, about what happened with Mr. Pike. People always talk, especially in a town this size where there's damn little else to do." Marshall met her eyes steadily. "But they'll talk regardless. Might as well give them something worth talking about." Helena thought about Eamon Pike, who'd been ashamed to be seen with her, who'd rejected her publicly to protect his precious dignity. And here was Marshall Drake, the largest employer in Northlake, owner of the biggest timber operation in the territory, inviting her to a town social where everyone would see them together. "I'd be honored," Helena said. Marshall's face split into a genuine smile. "Saturday evening, then, 7 o'clock. I'll collect you from the boarding house." As Helena walked back through town, she noticed something that would have been invisible a week ago. People nodded to her, called her by name. A woman she didn't recognize stopped her to ask about mending a quilt. A mill worker tipped his hat and asked if she'd gotten his message about the torn jacket. She was becoming part of Northlake's fabric, thread by thread. That afternoon, Helena walked to the general store with Marshall's list of foremen and enough money to purchase fabric for his remaining shirts. The proprietor, she'd learned his name was Thomas Garrett, greeted her with a broad smile. "Miss Crowell, perfect timing. I sold 3 of those work aprons you made. Ladies were very impressed with the quality. Can you make me 6 more by end of month?" Helena had made the aprons as an experiment, using scrap fabric left over from other projects. Simple designs, but well constructed with reinforced pockets and sturdy ties. She'd sold them to Garrett for 40 cents each, and he'd marked them up to 75. "I can do that," Helena said. "Same price as before?" "Agreed. And I'll need canvas for those shirts, I assume. I got a new Bolton just yesterday. Heavyweight, good quality." While Garrett measured and cut fabric, Helena studied the foremen's names Marshall had given her. She didn't know any of them personally, but she'd learned enough about Northlake's social structure to understand that reaching the timber crews meant going through these men. "Mr. Garrett," Helena asked, "do you know where I might find Samuel Hendricks, Robert Chen, or Thomas Blackwell?" Garrett looked up from the fabric. "The Drake timber foreman? They'll be at the mill yard most days, or at the Stag's Head in the evening. Hendricks is the tall fellow with the red beard. Chen is the one who actually runs things despite Hendricks technically being senior, and Blackwell is the young one with more ambition than sense." He paused. "Why are you looking for them?" "Marshall Drake suggested I introduce myself. I'm hoping to offer my services to the timber crews." Garrett's eyebrows rose. "Drake recommended you personally? Well now, that's something. He's not usually one to throw his weight around for favors. Must have been impressed with your work." I hope so. Word of advice, Miss Crowell, timbermen are rough but fair. They'll test you, make sure you can deliver what you promise. But if you prove yourself reliable, they're loyal customers. And they've got money to spend working the camps as they do. Helena paid for the fabric, spending 3 of her precious dollars, and carried it back to her room. But instead of starting on Marshall's shirts immediately, she changed into her most practical dress and walked toward the mill yard. The sawmill was the heart of North Lake's economy. Helena could hear it from blocks away. The shriek of the saw blade biting into logs, the shouts of workers, the crash of timber being moved and stacked. The air smelled of fresh-cut wood and machine oil. The mill yard was chaos organized by long practice. Logs waited in massive piles. Workers guided them onto the mill's conveyor system. The saw blade, easily 6 feet across, spun with terrifying speed, reducing ancient trees to boards with brutal efficiency. Other workers stacked the finished lumber, loading it onto wagons for transport. Helena stood at the yard's edge, suddenly aware of how out of place she looked. A tall woman in a dark dress, surrounded by men in work clothes covered in sawdust and sweat. Several workers noticed her, elbowing their companions and pointing. "Help you, miss?" A man with a red beard approached, wiping his hands on a rag. He was tall, not as tall as Marshall, but taller than most men, and had the weathered look of someone who'd spent years outdoors. "I'm looking for Samuel Hendricks." "You found him, and you are?" "Helena Crowell. Marshall Drake suggested I speak with you about offering sewing services to your crew." Hendrick's expression shifted from curiosity to understanding. "You're the seamstress. Heard about you. Also heard about what happened with Pike." He said it matter-of-factly, without judgment. "Drake mentioned he'd sent you our way, said you made him a shirt that actually fits, which is high praise from a man who usually makes do with whatever he can find." "I'm good at what I do," Helena said simply. "I'm offering mending, alterations, and custom work. Fair prices, quality guaranteed." "Show me." Hendricks gestured to the mill yard. "See that fellow by the lumber stack? The big one with the torn shirt? That's Robert Chen, my second foreman. If you can fix that shirt so it'll last another 6 months of hard work, I'll recommend you to the whole crew." Helena studied the man in question. He was broad-shouldered and muscular, and his shirt had a tear across the back that looked like it had caught on something sharp. The fabric around it was already starting to fray. "I can do that, but I'll need to take the shirt with me, work on it properly. Bring it to Flint's boarding house tomorrow morning before your shift starts, and I'll have it ready by evening." Hendricks considered this, then nodded. "Fair enough." "Chen!" he bellowed across the yard. "Get over here!" Robert Chen approached, and Helena saw that he was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 30, with intelligent eyes and an air of quiet competence. Hendricks explained the situation, and Chen studied Helena with frank curiosity. "You're the one Pike rejected," Chen said. "It wasn't a question." "I am." "His loss, I'd say. Man who can't see past the surface isn't worth much." Chen pulled off his torn shirt unselfconsciously, revealing another shirt underneath. "Here, but I need it back by tomorrow night. It's my lucky shirt." "You'll have it," Helena promised. Walking back to the boarding house with Chen's shirt bundled under her arm, Helena felt eyes on her from every direction. The story of her public rejection had spread through North Lake like wildfire, she knew. But now another story was spreading, the story of the seamstress who'd stayed instead of slinking back east in shame, who was making a place for herself through skill and determination. Let them talk, Helena thought. Let them see that she wasn't going anywhere. That evening, Helena worked on Chen's shirt by lamplight. The tear was worse than it had looked. The fabric had rotted slightly from sweat and weather, making a simple patch impossible. Instead, Helena carefully removed the damaged section, reinforced the surrounding area with a backing piece, and used a combination of darning and patching to restore the shirt's integrity. It took 3 hours of painstaking work, but when she finished, the repair was nearly invisible and stronger than the original fabric. She was putting the finishing touches on it when someone knocked on her door. It was late, past 9 o'clock, and most of the boarding house had settled for the evening. "Come in," Helena called, not looking up from her work. The door opened to reveal Marshall Drake, still in his work clothes but with his face freshly washed and his hair damp. "I'm sorry for the late hour," he said. "I saw your lamp burning and wanted to check that the foreman didn't give you any trouble." "No trouble at all. Mr. Chen gave me a shirt to repair as a test. I'm just finishing it now." Marshall stepped into the room, and Helena was struck again by his sheer size. The room seemed to shrink around him. He bent to examine her work, his face close enough that she could smell pine sap and soap. "That's remarkable," he said quietly. "I can barely see where the damage was." "That's the goal." Marshall straightened, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. Helena had spent her entire adult life being the tallest person in any room, looking down at everyone she spoke with. But Marshall was taller, broader, more substantial. Standing near him, she felt something she'd never experienced before. She felt proportional. She felt like she fit. "Helena," Marshall said, his voice dropping lower, "I want you to know something. What Pike did to you, that was about his own small-minded fears, not about anything wrong with you. You're—" He paused, seeming to search for words. "You're like one of the old-growth pines, tall and straight and strong. People look at them and see timber, see profit, but some of us see beauty." Helena's throat tightened. "That's a lovely thing to say." "It's true." Marshall shifted his weight, making the floorboards creak. "I should let you finish your work, but I wanted you to know, if anyone in this town gives you trouble, if Pike starts spreading more poison about you, you tell me. I don't have patience for men who hurt women to make themselves feel bigger." After he left, Helena sat holding Chen's repaired shirt and feeling something warm unfurl in her chest. She'd been courted before, in Philadelphia. Brief, awkward attempts by men who'd been more interested in her sewing skills than her company, or who'd seen her height as a curiosity to be conquered. But Marshall's attention felt different, genuine. Like he saw her, really saw her, and liked what he saw. The next morning, Helena delivered Chen's shirt just as the timber crews were gathering for their shift. Chen examined it carefully, turning it inside out, stretching the fabric, testing the repair. "This is damn good work," he said finally. "Better than good. My wife couldn't have done this well, and she's been sewing for 20 years. He raised his voice, addressing the gathered workers. "Any man here needs mending or new work clothes. Miss Crowell's your answer. Fair prices, quality work, fast turnaround. Tell your families." A murmur ran through the crowd. Several men approached immediately with questions about torn trousers, shirts that didn't fit right, jackets that needed patches. Helena took notes, quoted prices, arranged pickup and delivery times. By the time the morning shift started, she had 11 new commissions. The days fell into a pattern. Helena woke early, worked until her fingers cramped, took a brief walk through town to deliver finished work and collect new projects, then returned to her room to sew until lamplight failed her. She ate meals with the other boarders, listening to their stories about the mill, the timber camps, the endless appetite for lumber that drove North Lake's economy. She learned that Marshall Drake had built his timber empire from nothing. His father had been a drunk who died in a mill accident when Marshall was 15, leaving him with debts and a reputation for being his father's son. But Marshall had worked harder than anyone, proved himself more reliable than men twice his age, and slowly built Drake Timber into the most successful operation in the territory. She learned that Amon Pike ran a supply company that sold goods to the timber camps at inflated prices, and that his wealth came more from clever accounting than honest work. That he'd been courting the mayor's daughter, but she'd turned him down. That his pride was his most prominent feature, and his rejection of Helena had been about protecting that pride above all else. She learned that North Lake was hungry for civilization's comforts, and that a woman with skills could carve out a real place here if she was willing to work for it. The Saturday social arrived cold and clear. Helena had spent what little free time she'd had that week altering one of her own dresses, letting out seams, adding a new collar, changing the buttons to something more elegant. It was still a simple garment, dark green wool with black trim, but it fit her properly and made her feel less like she was wearing borrowed clothes. At 7 o'clock precisely, Marshall arrived at the boarding house. He wore what was clearly his best suit, dark gray, well-tailored but showing its age, the kind of garment a successful businessman might wear to church or important meetings. He'd shaved and combed his hair, and he held a small bouquet of late-season wildflowers. "For you," he said, offering the flowers with an awkwardness that was somehow endearing. "I know they're not much, but the flower shop closed last month and won't reopen until spring." They're perfect. Helena accepted the flowers, touched by the gesture. No one had given her flowers since she was 16, and a boy in her building had left daisies at her door before running away in embarrassment. The walk to the church was brief, but felt eternal. Everyone they passed stopped to stare. Helena kept her spine straight and her head high, but she felt the weight of those stares, the whispers, the speculation. Marshall seemed oblivious to it all. He walked beside her with easy confidence, occasionally pointing out buildings or sharing bits of town history. If he noticed people staring, he gave no sign. The church basement had been transformed for the social. Oil lamps cast warm light over rough wooden walls decorated with autumn leaves and pine boughs. Tables along one wall held refreshments, cider, cookies, sandwiches, a cake someone had made. A small group of musicians occupied one corner, fiddle, guitar, and accordion, playing a lively tune. The room fell silent when Helena and Marshall entered. Helena felt every eye turn toward them, felt the collective intake of breath. She was already taller than most women in the room, but standing beside Marshall, they were impossible to ignore. Giants among regular-sized people. A spectacle. Then Marshall did something Helena wasn't expecting. He didn't hurry her to a corner, didn't try to minimize their visibility. Instead, he led her directly to the center of the room and said, loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Helena, may I have this dance?" The musicians had faltered when Helena and Marshall entered, but at Marshall's words, they struck up a waltz. Helena had learned to dance as a girl, but she'd stopped trying years ago. Too many partners who barely reached her shoulder, too many awkward stumbles, too much humiliation. But Marshall was taller than her, broader than her. When he took her hand and placed his other hand at her waist, Helena didn't have to bend or adjust or make herself smaller. She simply followed his lead. They swept across the floor, and Helena felt something she'd never experienced on a dance floor before. She felt graceful. Marshall was a surprisingly good dancer for such a large man, moving with an economy that belied his size. He spun her, dipped her, guided her through the steps with quiet competence. Around them, other couples slowly joined the dance. The initial shock was wearing off, replaced by the social momentum that kept such gatherings moving forward. But Helena barely noticed. She was too focused on the feeling of Marshall's hand at her waist, the steady strength of him, the way he looked at her like she was something precious. When the waltz ended, Marshall led her to the refreshment table. People approached, cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. Mrs. Talbot introduced Helena to other women who needed sewing done. Robert Chen's wife thanked Helena for fixing her husband's lucky shirt, which he absolutely refused to throw away despite its condition. Samuel Hendrick's daughter asked if Helena could make her a dress for Christmas. Helena found herself surrounded by conversation, by acceptance, by the gradual integration into North Lake's social fabric. And through it all, Marshall stayed at her side, solid and steady as an old-growth pine. It wasn't until the evening was half over that Eamon Pike arrived. He entered with two other businessmen, all of them dressed in expensive suits that marked them as different from the mill workers and timbermen in their rough Sunday clothes. Eamon's eyes found Helena immediately, and something ugly crossed his face. He made his way across the room with deliberate purpose, his companions trailing behind. "Drake," Eamon said, his voice carrying, "I see you've taken up with my cast-off. How generous of you." The conversations around them died. Marshall went very still, and Helena felt the tension radiating from him like heat from a stove. "Miss Crowell is not anyone's cast-off," Marshall said quietly, "and you'd do well to remember that. Come now, Drake. We all know what happened. I ordered a bride, and what arrived was—" Eamon gestured vaguely at Helena. "Well, not what was advertised. I did the charitable thing by paying for her room and her return ticket. If she's chosen to stay and embarrass herself further, that's hardly my concern." Helena felt her face burn, felt the familiar shame trying to claw its way up her throat. But she thought about Chen's repaired shirt, about the 11 commissions waiting in her room, about the money she'd earned through her own skill and hard work. She thought about Marshall's hand at her waist during the waltz, about feeling proportional for the first time in her life. "Mr. Pike," Helena said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands, "you're absolutely right. I'm not what you ordered. I'm not a woman who shrinks to make small men feel big. I'm not someone who apologizes for existing. And I'm certainly not someone who needs your charity or your pity. You'll need something when the novelty wears off, Eamon shot back. When Drake here realizes what it's like to be seen with a woman who makes him look normal instead of freakish. When this town stops being amused by the spectacle and starts asking why a successful businessman would saddle himself with... He didn't get to finish. Marshall moved faster than Helena would have thought possible for a man his size. One moment he was standing beside her, the next he had Eamon Pike by the front of his expensive suit, lifting him until his feet barely touched the floor. "Listen very carefully," Marshall said, his voice deadly quiet. "You can insult me all you like, but you will not speak about Helena that way. Not in my presence, not in this town, not ever. Do you understand?" Eamon's face had gone pale. "You're threatening me? In front of witnesses? I'll have the marshal... The marshal is my cousin," Marshall said calmly. "And he was at my father's funeral when I was 15 and you tried to collect a debt from a child by taking the only coat he owned. He remembers that. So do a lot of people in this room. So by all means, go crying to him about how I defended a lady's honor from your insults." Marshall set Eamon down, but didn't step back. Eamon smoothed his suit with shaking hands, looked around at the faces watching him. Helena saw the calculation in his eyes. He was outnumbered here, outmaneuvered, facing a man with more physical power and more social capital than he could match. "This isn't over," Eamon said, trying to salvage some dignity. "Yes, it is," Marshall replied. "It's been over since the moment you decided your pride was worth more than your honor. Now get out of here before I forget I'm in a church basement and teach you better manners." Eamon left, his companions hurrying after him. The silence in the room stretched for a long moment before the musicians, bless them, struck up another tune, and conversation resumed with the forced brightness of people pretending they hadn't just witnessed something dramatic. Marshall turned to Helena. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have lost my temper." "You defended me," Helena said softly. "No one's ever defended me before." "Then you've been spending time with the wrong people." Marshall offered his hand. "Dance with me again? Let's remind this town what they just saw. Two tall people who refused to shrink for anyone's comfort." They danced 3 more dances, and by the third one, Helena realized something had shifted in the room. People weren't staring anymore. They were smiling, nodding, accepting this tall couple as part of North Lake's landscape, as natural as the mountains and the trees. When Marshall walked Helena back to the boarding house later that evening, the streets were quiet and cold. Their breath misted in the air between them. "Thank you for tonight," Helena said at the boarding house steps. "For inviting me, for defending me, for..." She paused, searching for words. "For making me feel like I belong somewhere. You do belong here." Marshall reached into his pocket and pulled out a small carved object. "I made this for you. It's nothing much, just something I whittle when I need to think." He pressed it into her palm. By the light of the street lamp, Helena saw it was a tiny pine cone, carved with such detail that she could make out individual scales. It was beautiful and delicate and completely unexpected from such large, work-roughened hands. "It's perfect," Helena whispered. "Tall things aren't flaws," Marshall said quietly. "They're wonders. The tallest trees catch the most sun. They can see the farthest. They stand through storms that flatten everything else. That's not something to apologize for, Helena. That's something to celebrate." He left her standing on the boarding house steps, holding a carved pine cone and feeling like maybe, just maybe, she'd found a place where she could stand at her full height without apology. Inside her room, Helena set the pine cone on her bedside table where she'd see it first thing every morning. Then she sat down at her work table and looked at the pile of commissions waiting for her attention. Marshall's remaining shirts, mending for 3 timber workers, a dress alteration for Mrs. Talbot, the work aprons for Garrett's store. She had work. She had money. She had a place to sleep and food to eat. She had Marshall Drake's carved pine cone and his steady presence and his unwavering belief that her height was something wonderful instead of something shameful. She had a future in North Lake, if she wanted it. Helena threaded her needle and began to sew, her fingers moving with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was building, stitch by careful stitch. The weeks that followed the town's social should have been peaceful. Helena's business was thriving beyond her expectations. She'd completed Marshall's remaining shirts. each one earning his enthusiastic approval and recommendations to more timber workers. Her room at the boarding house had become a makeshift shop, with fabric bolts stacked in corners and garments in various stages of completion hanging from hooks she'd installed on the walls. Marjorie had stopped charging her the standard rate, instead working out an arrangement where Helena paid less rent in exchange for keeping all of the boarding house's linens and curtains in good repair. Helena had even begun setting aside money for her own sewing machine. Thomas Garrett at the general store had shown her a catalog with a Singer model that could be ordered from Seattle. It would cost $45, a fortune. But with her current pace of work, she could save enough in 4 months, maybe 3 if she took on extra projects. She was building something real, something that belonged to her. But Eamon Pike wasn't finished with her. It started small. A whisper here, a casual comment there. Helena first noticed it when Mrs. Talbot mentioned that someone had asked her whether Helena had the proper permits to run a business from the boarding house. Then Robert Chen's wife stopped by to mention, almost apologetically, that someone had been asking questions about whether Helena's prices were fair or if she was taking advantage of the timber workers. "Who's asking these questions?" Helena had asked. Mrs. Chen had looked uncomfortable. "I didn't want to say, but it's Pike. He's been going around town talking to the council members, saying things about how there's laws about operating businesses without proper licensing, about how newcomers need to prove themselves before they're allowed to just set up shop." Helena's stomach had tightened. "I'm just sewing, taking in mending. How does that require licensing?" "It probably doesn't," Mrs. Chen had assured her. "But Pike knows how to make trouble. He knows which men on the council owe him favors, which ones he can pressure. You should talk to Marshall. He'll know what to do." But Helena had been reluctant to run to Marshall with her problems. He'd already defended her once, already made himself a target of Pike's resentment by choosing to court her publicly. She didn't want to be the kind of woman who needed constant rescue, who couldn't handle her own difficulties, so she tried to handle it herself. She'd visited the town clerk, a nervous man named Aldrich who'd shuffled through papers and mumbled about regulations, and finally admitted that technically, yes, there were rules about operating commercial enterprises within town limits, but those rules had never been enforced for small operations like hers. "But if someone files a formal complaint," Aldrich had said, not meeting her eyes, "then I'd have to investigate. Town law requires it." Helena had left his office with a sick feeling in her stomach. Pike was laying groundwork, building a case, finding ways to hurt her without directly confronting her again. She'd worked late that night, finishing a jacket alteration for one of the mill workers, trying not to think about what Pike might be planning. The boarding house was quiet. Most residents had gone to bed when she heard heavy footsteps on the stairs. She knew those footsteps now, knew the particular rhythm of Marshall's gait, the way the floorboards protested under his weight. His knock was soft, considerate of the late hour. "Come in," Helena called, setting down her sewing. Marshall entered, and she could see immediately that something was wrong. His jaw was tight, his eyes angry. "I heard what Pike's doing," he said without preamble. "Trying to get you shut down with permit nonsense. Helena, why didn't you tell me?" "Because I don't want to be a burden." Helena stood, facing him. "You've already done so much for me. I need to be able to stand on my own." "Standing on your own doesn't mean facing everything alone." Marshall's voice softened. "Pike is doing this because of me, because I chose you over his pride. That makes it my responsibility to help fix it." "No." Helena shook her head. "That makes it my life, my business, my fight. I won't be the woman who needs a man to solve all her problems. Then let me be the friend who stands beside you while you solve them yourself." Marshall stepped closer. "Helena, Pike isn't going to stop. He's talking to Judge Alden Hart, trying to convince him to come to Northlake and rule on whether you have the legal right to operate your business. He's claiming you violated some kind of contract by staying in town instead of leaving." "What contract? There was no contract. He rejected me on this platform before anything was signed or agreed to." "I know that. You know that. But Pike is good at twisting words, at making things sound worse than they are. And Judge Hart—" Marshall paused. "He's a hard man. Fair, but hard. If Pike presents the case the right way, Hart might rule against you just to establish legal precedent." Helena sank back into her chair. "So what do I do?" You fight. Marshall knelt beside her chair so they were at eye level. You tell the truth. You show the town what you've built, and you don't let Pike's small-minded vindictiveness destroy something good. And you let me help, not because you're weak, but because fighting together is smarter than fighting alone. Helena looked at this man who'd sought her out when she'd been at her lowest, who'd given her work when she'd needed it most, who defended her honor and carved her pine cones and looked at her like she was exactly the right size. She thought about Philadelphia and all the years she'd spent trying to be small and invisible and inoffensive. She thought about the woman she'd been when she'd stepped off that train, full of hope and fear in equal measure. She wasn't that woman anymore. All right, Helena said. Tell me what we need to do. Over the next week, Marshall and Helena prepared. Marshall spoke to the town council members he knew, the ones whose businesses depended on Drake timber, reminding them that Helena had brought a valuable service to Northlake and that driving her out would only hurt the town. Helena documented every transaction she'd made, every garment mended, every commission completed, every satisfied customer. She asked her clients to write testimonials, and they did, filling 3 pages with praise for her work. Mrs. Talbot wrote about the dress alteration that had made her feel beautiful for the first time in years. Robert Chen described the quality of her repairs. Thomas Garrett provided a letter stating that the apron she'd made for his store had sold out immediately and that he considered her a valuable business partner. Helena also went through her correspondence with Eamon Pike, organizing the letters chronologically, highlighting the places where he'd accepted her height and expressed eagerness to meet her. She created a timeline showing that he'd had 8 months to ask detailed questions about her appearance and had chosen not to, that his rejection had been instantaneous and public, and that she'd attempted to leave town immediately but had stayed only after he'd made it clear there would be no marriage. This is good, Marshall said, reviewing her documentation. This shows you acted in good faith, that you came here for legitimate reasons and stayed for legitimate reasons. Will it be enough? I don't know, but it's the truth, and that counts for something. The summons came on a cold December morning. Helena was working on a particularly intricate dress commission. The mayor's wife had asked for a formal gown for the Christmas celebration, when Marjorie knocked on her door with an official-looking envelope. "This came for you," Marjorie said, her face concerned, "delivered by the town clerk himself." Helena opened the envelope with trembling fingers. The letter inside was written in formal legal language, but the meaning was clear enough. Judge Alden Hart would be arriving in Northlake in 3 days' time to hear a complaint filed by Eamon Pike against Helena Crowell regarding alleged breach of contract, fraudulent misrepresentation, and operating an unlicensed commercial enterprise within town limits. Helena was required to appear before the judge at 2 o'clock in the afternoon on December 15th in the Northlake Town Hall. 3 days, Helena whispered. He's giving me 3 days to prepare a legal defense. That's not much time, Marjorie agreed. But you've got friends in this town, Helena. Don't forget that. Helena spent those 3 days in a blur of preparation and fear. Marshall hired a lawyer from Port Clement, a sharp woman named Sarah Brennan who specialized in frontier law, and spent 2 days going over Helena's case with her. Sarah was blunt in her assessment. Pike doesn't have much of a legal leg to stand on, she said, but judges in frontier territories have broad discretion. If Hart decides he wants to make an example of you, he can. And from what I know of Hart, he's not fond of women who operate outside traditional roles. So I'm going to lose because I'm a woman trying to earn a living? Helena asked. Maybe. Or maybe you'll win because you're a woman who's proven herself valuable to this community. Sarah met Helena's eyes. Either way, you need to be prepared to speak for yourself, to tell your story in your own words. Can you do that? Helena thought about the platform where Pike had rejected her, about the boarding house room where she'd decided to stay, about the pine cone Marshall had carved, still sitting on her bedside table, about every garment she'd mended, every customer she'd satisfied, every dollar she'd earned through skill and determination. Yes, Helena said. I can do that. The morning of December 15th dawned clear and brutally cold. Helena dressed in her best outfit, the green wool dress she'd worn to the town social, with her grandmother's cameo pinned at her throat. She braided her hair and pinned it in a crown around her head, adding every inch of height she possessed. If she was going to fight, she was going to do it standing at her full measure. Marshall arrived at the boarding house at 1:30, dressed in his best suit. Sarah Brennan was with him, carrying a leather case full of documents. "Ready?" Marshall asked. "No," Helena admitted, "but I'm going anyway." The walk to town hall felt eternal. People lined the streets. Word had spread that Judge Hart was coming, that there would be a public hearing, that something dramatic was about to happen. Helena kept her eyes forward, her spine straight, refusing to show the fear that coiled in her stomach. Town Hall was Northlake's attempt at grandeur, a 2-story brick building with tall windows and a clock tower that actually kept accurate time. The main meeting room had been set up like a courtroom with tables facing a raised platform where Judge Hart would sit. Rows of chairs for spectators filled the back half of the room. Every chair was occupied. Helena scanned the crowd and saw familiar faces. Mrs. Talbot and the other boarders from Flint's, Robert Chen and his wife, Thomas Garrett, Samuel Hendricks, the mayor and his wife, workers from the timber crews still in their work clothes who'd left their shifts early to attend. Marjorie Flint sat in the front row, her face set in determined support, and there, on the opposite side of the room, sat Eamon Pike with 2 other men Helena recognized as council members who'd always seemed friendly with him. Pike looked confident, almost smug, his expensive suit pressed to perfection. "All rise for Judge Alden Hart," the town clerk called. Everyone stood as the judge entered. Hart was a man in his 60s, tall and lean, with white hair and cold blue eyes. He wore black robes and carried himself with the absolute authority of someone who'd been making binding decisions for decades. He took his seat on the platform, surveyed the crowded room, and gestured for everyone to sit. "This is an unusual case," Hart began, his voice carrying easily through the room. "I generally hear criminal matters and property disputes, but Mr. Pike has brought concerns that merit examination, particularly regarding how this community handles business licensing and contract law. We will proceed as follows. Mr. Pike will present his complaint. Miss Crowell will respond. I will hear testimony from witnesses. Then I will make my ruling, which will be final and binding." He turned to Eamon Pike. "Mr. Pike, please state your complaint." Pike stood, smoothing his jacket. He'd prepared remarks. Helena could tell. He spoke smoothly, confidently, with the ease of someone accustomed to public speaking. "Your Honor, I brought Miss Crowell to Northlake under specific understanding and expectation. Through 8 months of correspondence, she presented herself as a suitable bride, modest, appropriate, conventional in appearance. Upon her arrival, I discovered she had grossly misrepresented herself. She is, as this court can plainly see, unusually tall, freakishly so. This was a material misrepresentation that rendered our understanding void. I mentioned my height in my letters," Helena said, unable to stop herself. "Miss Crowell, you will have your turn to speak," Judge Hart said sharply. "Continue, Mr. Pike. After discovering this misrepresentation, I did the charitable thing. I paid for Miss Crowell's lodging and purchased a return ticket to Philadelphia. Any reasonable person would have accepted this generous settlement and departed. Instead, Miss Crowell chose to remain in Northlake and establish a business enterprise without obtaining proper licensing or approval from the town council. She has been operating in violation of municipal codes for nearly 2 months. And what harm has this caused you personally, Mr. Pike?" Judge Hart asked. Pike's expression shifted, becoming harder. "She has damaged my reputation, Your Honor, made me a subject of mockery. People say I'm too small-minded to appreciate an unusual woman. They question my judgment, and she has done this while operating illegally within our town limits, thumbing her nose at proper procedure and the rule of law." "I see. Miss Crowell, you may respond." Helena stood, and the room seemed to tilt. Every eye was on her. Judge Hart watched her with those cold blue eyes. Pike wore a satisfied smirk, but Marshall sat at the table beside her, solid and steady, and when she glanced at him, he nodded encouragement. "Your Honor," Helena began, and was grateful her voice didn't shake. "Mr. Pike is correct that I am tall. I'm 6 feet and 2 inches. I've been this height since I was 17 years old, and in my 3rd letter to Mr. Pike, I told him exactly that. I described my height in detail because I didn't want there to be any surprises. I wanted whoever might marry me to know exactly what they were getting." She pulled out Pike's letters, the ones she'd organized so carefully. Mr. Pike responded by saying, and I quote, "I am a man of modern thinking. What matters is the quality of one's character, not the measurement of one's frame. I look forward to meeting a woman of such unique distinction." He wrote that, "Your Honor," in his own hand. He had 8 months to ask more questions, to request a photograph, to express any concerns. He chose not to. "The letters prove nothing," Pike interrupted. "She could have been deliberately vague." "Mr. Pike, you will wait your turn," Judge Hart said. "Continue, Miss Crowell." "When I arrived, Mr. Pike took one look at me and rejected me publicly, on the platform, in front of witnesses. He didn't take me aside. He didn't give me even a moment of courtesy. He simply decided I was too embarrassing to be associated with and arranged for my departure, which I was prepared to accept." Helena's hands tightened on the letters. "I didn't come to Northlake to cause trouble or to damage Mr. Pike's reputation. I came because I believed his promises. When those promises proved false, I tried to leave. But I'd given up everything in Philadelphia, my job, my room, my life there. I had nowhere to go and very little money. So when Mrs. Flint offered me a chance to earn my keep through my sewing skills, I took it, not to spite Mr. Pike, but to survive." "And the business licensing?" Judge Hart asked. "I wasn't aware I needed specific licenses for small-scale mending and alteration work done from my boarding house room. When Mr. Aldrich informed me of the regulations, I immediately began the process to comply. But before I could complete that process, Mr. Pike filed this complaint." "She's operating a full commercial enterprise," Pike interjected, "making goods for sale, taking contracts." "I'm a seamstress," Helena said, and her voice carried through the room. "I fix torn clothing. I alter garments that don't fit properly. I make simple items like aprons and work shirts. Every town has seamstresses, Your Honor, and most of them work from their homes because that's where the sewing equipment is. Am I to be punished for that? Or am I being punished because Mr. Pike's pride can't tolerate the fact that I've built a life here after he tried to send me away in shame?" The room erupted. People shouting support, shouting objections. Judge Hart banging his gavel for order. Through the chaos, Helena kept her eyes on the judge, watching him watch the crowd, seeing him calculate what this case really meant. When order was finally restored, Judge Hart said, "I'd like to hear from witnesses. Who can speak to Miss Crowell's character and business practices?" Marjorie Flint stood first. "Your Honor, I run a respectable boarding house. I've known Miss Crowell since the day she arrived, and she's been nothing but honest and hardworking. She pays her rent on time, keeps her room neat, and has never caused a moment of trouble. The mending work she does is exceptional quality, and she charges fair prices. She's exactly the kind of person we want in Northlake." Mrs. Talbot was next. "I'm the school teacher, Your Honor. I've lived in this town for 12 years. Miss Crowell altered a dress for me, and her work was so good I've recommended her to half the women in town. She's skilled, professional, and kind. We're lucky to have her." Robert Chen stood, hat in his hands. "Your Honor, I'm a foreman for Drake Timber. Miss Crowell repaired a shirt for me that I thought was beyond saving. She did it for a fair price and did it well. My crew respects her work, and several of them have hired her for various projects. She's not running some big operation. She's just a woman with a needle and thread, trying to make an honest living." Thomas Garrett testified about the aprons Helena had made for his store, about how they'd sold immediately and how customers had asked for more. The mayor's wife spoke about the dress Helena was currently making for her. 3 timber workers testified about Helena's reliability and fair pricing, and then Marshall stood. "Your Honor, I'd like to speak to Miss Crowell's character." Marshall's voice was steady, but Helena could hear the emotion underneath. When Helena arrived in Northlake, she'd been humiliated publicly by a man who'd made her promises and then broke them the moment she proved inconvenient to his pride. Most people would have crumbled under that, would have taken the return ticket and fled. But Helena stayed, not because she wanted to cause trouble, but because she had courage, because she believed in herself enough to try building something here. Marshall turned to look at Pike. "Eamon Pike wants this court to believe that Helena is operating some kind of fraudulent enterprise. The truth is simpler and sadder. He's a man whose pride was wounded by a woman who refused to disappear when he demanded it. He thought he could reject her, and she'd slink away in shame. Instead, she thrived. And that's what he can't forgive." "Mr. Drake," Judge Hart said dryly, "are you perhaps biased in Miss Crowell's favor?" Absolutely, Your Honor. I'm courting her. Marshall said it clearly, proudly, letting everyone in the room hear it. I think she's remarkable. And if this court rules against her, if you tell her she has to leave town or stop working because Pike can't tolerate her success, then you're not upholding law. You're upholding one man's vindictive pride. The room erupted again. Judge Hart let it continue for a moment, his expression unreadable, before banging his gavel. Order. I will have order in this courtroom. When silence finally fell, Hart turned to Pike. Mr. Pike, do you have witnesses to present? Pike stood, and Helena could see he was flustered. Marshall's testimony had been more forceful than he'd expected. Your Honor, the facts speak for themselves. There were understandings between Miss Crowell and myself. Were these understandings in writing? Hart interrupted. Some correspondence, but the understanding was clear. Was there a formal contract, a signed agreement of any kind? Pike's jaw worked. The nature of mail-order bride arrangements is based on mutual good faith. That's not an answer, Mr. Pike. Was there a signed contract? No, Pike admitted. But there was an implied contract based on her letters. An implied contract that you claim she violated by being precisely as tall as she told you she was? Judge Hart's tone was cutting now. Mr. Pike, I've read Miss Crowell's letters. She stated her height clearly and repeatedly. You acknowledged it and claimed it didn't matter. That doesn't sound like misrepresentation to me. That sounds like you changed your mind when confronted with reality and are now attempting to use the law to punish Miss Crowell for your own poor judgment. Pike's face flushed. Your Honor, the business licensing violations are minor infractions at worst, and ones that Miss Crowell has attempted to remedy once informed of them. Judge Hart looked out at the crowded room, at the faces watching him, and Helena saw something shift in his expression. This court has heard testimony from numerous respected members of the North Lake community, all praising Miss Crowell's work and character. I've seen evidence that she conducts her business honestly and fairly, and I've heard Mr. Pike fail to articulate any actual harm he's suffered beyond embarrassment of his own making. The judge stood, and everyone in the room rose with him. I rule as follows. There was no binding contract between Eamon Pike and Helena Crowell. Miss Crowell made no material misrepresentations in her correspondence. Her decision to remain in North Lake and establish a seamstress business was entirely within her rights as a citizen of this territory. As for the business licensing, I direct the town clerk to expedite Miss Crowell's licensing application without fee, considering the minor nature of her operation and the valuable service she provides. Hart turned his cold eyes on Eamon Pike. Mr. Pike, this court finds your complaint frivolous and vindictive. You will pay court costs and Miss Crowell's legal fees. And if you bring any further harassment of Miss Crowell to my attention, I will consider sanctions for abuse of the legal process. Am I clear? Your Honor, Pike began. Am I clear, Mr. Pike? Yes, Your Honor. Good. This matter is concluded. Miss Crowell, you're free to continue your business without interference. Court is adjourned. The gavel came down, and the room exploded into applause. Helena stood frozen, unable to quite process what had just happened. She'd won. Judge Hart had ruled in her favor. Pike had lost. Marjorie reached her first, pulling Helena into a tight hug despite their height difference. Then Mrs. Talbot, then Robert Chen's wife, then a stream of people wanting to congratulate her, to shake her hand, to tell her they'd never doubted she'd prevail. Through the crowd, Helena saw Eamon Pike leaving through a side door, his face dark with humiliation. The two council members who'd accompanied him followed, neither meeting anyone's eyes. They'd bet on Pike's influence and lost. In a town like North Lake, that kind of public defeat would damage Pike's standing for years. Helena should have felt triumphant. Instead, she just felt tired. Marshall found her as the crowd was dispersing. He didn't say anything, just offered his arm, and Helena took it gratefully. They walked out of town hall together into the December afternoon, the cold air a shock after the heated courtroom. You were brilliant in there, Marshall said as they walked toward the boarding house. The way you spoke, the way you stood up for yourself. Helena, I was so proud of you. I was terrified the entire time. Being brave doesn't mean not being scared, it means being scared and doing it anyway. Marshall stopped walking, turning to face her fully. Pike's finished in this town, you know. Hart's ruling made it clear that Pike abused the legal system for personal revenge. The council won't forget that. His business associates won't forget that. He tried to destroy you and destroyed himself instead. Helena thought about that, about Pike's humiliation matching her own from the train platform. She'd wanted him to face consequences for his cruelty, but now that he had, she felt no satisfaction. Just a weary recognition that hurt people often hurt others, and the cycle rarely ends well for anyone. I just want to go back to my room and sleep for a week, Helena admitted. After tonight, Marshall's voice held a note of mystery. There's something I want to show you. Will you let me take you somewhere? It's not far, just up the ridge above town. Marshall, I'm exhausted. Please, it's important, and I promise it'll be worth the walk. Something in his voice made Helena agree. They stopped at the boarding house long enough for Helena to change into warmer clothes and sturdy boots. Then Marshall led her through town and onto a trail that climbed into the hills. The December sun was already sinking toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. They climbed for 20 minutes, Marshall shortening his stride to match hers, neither of them speaking. The trail wound through second-growth forest, trees 30 years old replacing the giants that had been logged to build North Lake, until it crested a ridge that looked down over the town and the valley beyond. And there, in a clearing on the ridge, stood a house. Not finished, but close. A timber-frame structure built from massive logs, the kind that could only have come from old-growth trees. Large windows that would fill the interior with light. A wide porch that wrapped around the front. And the door. The door was 7 feet tall. Helena stared at it, at the house, at Marshall's face as he watched her reaction. I started building this 3 years ago, Marshall said quietly. After my business stabilized, after I had enough money to do more than just survive. I designed it for someone my size. Someone who was tired of ducking through doorways and bumping their head on low ceilings and feeling like the world was built too small. He stepped closer to Helena. I was building it for myself, for the future I thought I'd have, alone but comfortable. And then you stepped off that train, and you stood there on that platform taller than any woman I'd ever seen, and I watched Pike reject you, and I thought— Marshall paused. I thought, there she is, the person this house was actually meant for. Helena couldn't speak, couldn't move. The house stood before her like a dream made solid, like an answer to prayers she'd never quite had words for. I'm not asking you to marry me, Marshall continued. Not yet. We've only known each other 2 months, and you deserve time to be sure of your own feelings. But I'm telling you that I'm building a future, and I'm hoping you'll want to be part of it. I'm telling you that I see you, Helena. All of you. Your height, and your strength, and your courage, and the way you refuse to shrink for anyone's comfort. And I'm asking if maybe, someday, you might want to share a home built exactly to your measure. Helena walked toward the house as if pulled by invisible strings. She climbed the porch steps, sturdy, wide, built to support significant weight. She reached up to touch the door frame, easily clearing it with her full height. Through the windows, she could see the interior. A great room with high ceilings, a kitchen with counters that wouldn't require constant bending, a staircase with treads deep enough for large feet. You built this, Helena whispered. You built this before you even knew me. I built this for someone tall, Marshall said, joining her on the porch. For someone tired of apologizing for the space they take up. The fact that person turned out to be you feels less like coincidence and more like destiny. Helena turned to face him, this giant of a man who'd seen her at her lowest and chosen to lift her up, who'd defended her honor, supported her business, stood beside her in court, who'd carved her pine cones and waltzed with her, and now offered her a home built to fit her exactly. I need to show you something, Helena said. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the pine cone he'd given her at the town social. She'd been carrying it like a talisman, a reminder that someone saw her height as wonderful instead of wrong. I've kept this with me every day since you gave it to me. Every time I felt small or scared or like maybe Pike was right about me being too much, I touch this and remember what you said. The tall things are wonders. Marshall's expression softened. They are. You are. I'm not ready to marry you, Helena said, and saw understanding rather than disappointment in his eyes. Not because I don't care for you. I do, more than I expected to after such a short time. but because I need to know I can stand on my own first. I need to know that I chose you from a place of strength, not desperation. I understand, and I can wait. But I would like— Helena paused, searching for words. I would like to keep spending time with you, to see where this goes, to imagine what it might be like to live in a house with doorways. I don't have to duck through, and a man who thinks my height is something to celebrate. Marshall smiled, and it transformed his stern face into something bright and hopeful. I'd like that too. They stood on the porch of the unfinished house as the sun set over North Lake, two tall people looking down at the town that had tried to reject one of them and ended up embracing them both. Below them, lights were beginning to glow in windows. Smoke rose from chimneys. The sawmill had gone quiet for the evening, but come morning it would roar to life again, processing the forest into the lumber that built this frontier world. Helena thought about the woman who'd stepped off the train 2 months ago, full of hope and fear and desperate dreams. That woman had believed she needed someone else to make her life complete, to give her a place in the world. That woman had thought shrinking was the price of acceptance. But the woman standing on this porch, the woman who'd built a business from nothing, who'd faced down her accuser in a courtroom, who'd learned that height was something to celebrate, she understood that she'd been complete all along. She just needed a place built large enough to let her stand at her full measure. Will you come to dinner tomorrow night? Marshall asked as they prepared to descend from the ridge. Nothing fancy, just a meal at the boarding house, but I'd like to spend more time with you that isn't about court cases or business. I'd love that, Helena said. They walked back down the trail as darkness gathered, and when they reached the boarding house, Marshall didn't kiss her. Instead, he took her hand and bowed over it with old-fashioned courtesy, his eyes meeting hers with a warmth that promised everything a kiss might have said. Good night, Helena. Sleep well. You earned it. In her room, Helena stood at the window and looked up toward the ridge where Marshall's house stood in the darkness. Her house, maybe. Someday, when she was ready, when she'd proven to herself that she could build her own life on her own terms, she picked up her sewing, the mayor's wife's dress still needed finishing, and worked by lamplight, her needle flashing in the steady rhythm of someone who knew exactly what they were building, stitch by careful stitch. Winter settled over North Lake with a vengeance. Snow came in December, heavy and persistent, transforming the muddy logging town into something almost beautiful. The massive stumps that dotted the landscape became white monuments. The mill's roar was muffled by the blanket of snow. And Helena's business, rather than slowing with the weather, exploded. Cold weather meant torn coats, worn mittens, boots that needed mending. It meant timber workers needed warmer clothing, families needed quilts repaired, and everyone needed someone with skilled hands to keep the cold at bay. Helena worked from dawn until her lamp oil ran low, her fingers moving in the familiar dance of needle and thread. She'd earned enough by Christmas to order the Singer sewing machine from Seattle. Thomas Garrett had assured her it would arrive by spring when the mountain passes cleared. The thought of it filled Helena with a fierce pride. Soon she'd have real equipment, the kind professional seamstresses used. She'd be able to work faster, take on larger projects, maybe even hire an assistant. Marshall came to dinner twice a week, always at the boarding house where everything remained proper and respectable. They talked about everything: his childhood growing up with an unreliable father, her years in Philadelphia trying to make herself invisible, his plans for expanding Drake Timber into the untouched forest to the north, her dreams of eventually opening a proper shop on Main Street. Sometimes they simply sat in comfortable silence while Helena sewed and Marshall whittled, creating an ever-growing collection of carved pine cones that now lined her windowsill. They went on walks when the weather permitted, always chaperoned by the visibility of the small town. They attended church on Sundays, sitting together in the back pew where their height wouldn't block anyone's view. And slowly, carefully, they built something solid. But Marshall never mentioned the house on the ridge again, and Helena was both grateful and frustrated by his patience. She thought about that house constantly, the tall doorways, the high ceilings, the kitchen counters built for someone her height. She thought about what it would mean to accept it, to accept him, to finally stop waiting for the other shoe to drop. Because part of Helena still waited for Marshall to change his mind, still expected him to wake up one morning and realize she was too much trouble, too visible, too tall. Eamon Pike's rejection had left scars deeper than Helena wanted to admit, and sometimes in the dark of night she wondered if Marshall's patience was simply a different form of polite withdrawal. The town, at least, had fully accepted her. Eamon Pike had left Northlake in January, relocating his business to Port Clement, where his humiliation hadn't been quite so public. His departure had been quiet, almost sneaking, and Helena had felt something release in her chest when she heard he was gone. The threat of his vindictiveness, the constant awareness that he might try to hurt her again, it had been exhausting. Without it, she could finally breathe. January melted into February, and with it came the first hints that winter wouldn't last forever. The days grew incrementally longer. Snow began to melt during the afternoons, refreezing at night into treacherous ice, and Marshall became increasingly distracted, checking his pocket watch during dinners, cutting their conversations short to attend to business matters he wouldn't explain. "Is everything all right?" Helena asked one evening after he'd excused himself for the third time in a week. "With your business, I mean. You seem preoccupied." "Everything's fine," Marshall assured her. "Just some projects that need attention. Nothing for you to worry about." But Helena did worry. She'd grown to understand Marshall's moods, the way his jaw tightened when he was stressed, the way his hands moved more quickly with his whittling knife when he was thinking through a problem. Something was occupying his mind, and his refusal to share it stung in ways Helena hadn't expected. "Marshall," she said carefully, "if something's wrong, you can tell me. I thought we were building trust here." Marshall set down the piece of wood he'd been carving, another pine cone, this one more elaborate than usual, and met her eyes. "Nothing's wrong, I promise. I'm just working on something I want to surprise you with, and I'm finding it harder than expected to keep it secret." "A surprise?" "A good one, I hope." His smile was warm but tired. "Just be patient with me a little longer. Another few weeks and I'll be able to explain everything." Helena tried to be patient. She focused on her work, on the steady accumulation of savings, on the approaching spring, and all it promised. But Marshall's distraction gnawed at her, especially when he began canceling their dinners with apologetic notes delivered by Robert Chen or one of his other workers. "Drake's pushing hard on something," Chen told her one afternoon when he brought yet another apology. "Working the crew's overtime, driving himself hardest of all. I've never seen him this focused. Must be important." "Did he tell you what it is?" Chen shook his head. "Just that he needs the Ridge project finished before the spring thaw. We're all working extra shifts, and the pay's good, so nobody's complaining. But whatever he's building up there, he wants it done fast." The Ridge project, the house. Marshall was finishing the house. Helena's heart stuttered at the realization. He was rushing to complete it, pushing his crews to work through the last weeks of winter, driving himself to exhaustion. But why the urgency? And why the secrecy? They'd agreed to take things slowly, to let their relationship develop naturally. So why was Marshall suddenly acting like he was running out of time? She tried to ask him about it when he finally made it to dinner the following week, but he deflected with tired charm and changed the subject to her plans for the sewing machine. Helena let him redirect the conversation, but her worry deepened. Something was happening, something Marshall wasn't telling her, and the not knowing was worse than almost any truth could be. It was Marjorie who finally explained it to her. Helena was working late on a particularly complex alteration when Marjorie knocked and entered without waiting for permission. The boarding house owner carried 2 cups of tea and a determined expression. "You need to stop working and talk to me," Marjorie said, setting 1 cup on Helena's work table and settling into the room's only chair. "Because you've been moping around here for a week, and I'm tired of watching it." "I'm not moping, I'm busy." "You're worrying yourself sick over Drake, and you're too stubborn to just ask him what's going on." Marjorie sipped her tea. "So I'm going to tell you, because someone needs to, and it might as well be me." Helena set down her sewing. "Tell me what?" "Marshall Drake is finishing that house before the spring thaw because his mother's ring is burning a hole in his pocket, and he's terrified you're going to say no." Marjorie said it bluntly, without preamble. "He's been carrying that ring since January, working himself half to death to finish the house so he can propose properly. Wants to be able to offer you something real, something complete. Wants you to see the whole future he's imagining before you make your decision." Helena felt the world tilt. "His mother's ring?" "She died when he was 12. Left him that ring, and not much else. Drake's been saving it for years, waiting for the right woman." Marjorie leaned forward. Helena, that man is in love with you, has been since you stood on that platform and refused to shrink for Pike's comfort, and he's scared out of his mind that you're going to reject him because you still don't believe you deserve something good. I'm not going to reject him, Helena protested. I care about him deeply. I've just needed time to what? Prove you don't need him? Marjorie's voice softened. Honey, I understand. After what Pike did, after a lifetime of people making you feel like you're too much, you needed to know you could stand alone. And you've proven that. You've built a successful business. You've made a place for yourself in this town. You've faced down a judge and won. You've done everything you set out to do. So what are you still waiting for? Helena stared into her teacup, watching the steam rise and dissipate. What was she waiting for? What final test did she need to pass before she allowed herself to accept happiness? I'm afraid, Helena admitted quietly. I'm afraid that if I let myself need him, if I accept that house and that ring and that future, I'll lose myself somehow. I'll become just someone's wife instead of Helena Crowell, seamstress. Helena Crowell, who built something from nothing. Who says you have to be just one thing? Marjorie stood, crossing to the window where the carved pine cones lined the sill. She picked one up, turning it in the lamplight. Drake carves these for you because he sees you as something beautiful and natural and strong, not something to be changed or diminished, just something to be appreciated as it is. You think marrying him means losing yourself? I think it means having someone who sees all of you and wants to build a life big enough to hold everything you are. After Marjorie left, Helena sat in the quiet of her room and let herself imagine it, accepting Marshall's proposal, moving into that house with its tall doorways and high ceilings, waking up beside someone who thought her height was wonderful, building a life with a man who'd seen her at her lowest and chosen to lift her up instead of pushing her down. It terrified her. It also filled her with a longing so intense it made her chest ache. The next morning, Helena did something she hadn't done since arriving in Northlake. She closed her business for the day. She left a note on her door directing urgent repairs to come back tomorrow, bundled herself in her warmest coat, and set out through the melting snow toward the ridge. The trail was treacherous with mud and ice, but Helena navigated it carefully, her long legs making quick work of the steep sections. She could hear activity before she saw it, hammering, sawing, men's voices calling instructions. She crested the ridge to find the house transformed. Where before it had been a skeleton, now it was nearly complete. The roof was finished, shingled in cedar that would weather to silver. The porch wrapped fully around the structure. Windows were installed, their glass catching the weak February sun, and everywhere men were working, installing trim, hanging doors, painting, finishing. Marshall stood in the center of it all, directing workers with easy authority. He'd removed his coat despite the cold, his shirt sleeves rolled up, sawdust in his hair. He looked exhausted and exhilarated and more alive than Helena had ever seen him. Then he saw her, and everything else seemed to fade. Marshall said something to the nearest worker and crossed the muddy yard in long strides. His face was unreadable. Surprise, concern, something deeper Helena couldn't quite identify. Helena, I wasn't expecting you. Is everything all right? Marjorie told me what you're doing, Helena said without preamble. About the ring. About why you're rushing to finish this. Marshall's jaw tightened. She had no right. She had every right. Because I've been so busy protecting myself from disappointment that I missed what was right in front of me. Helena gestured at the house, at the crews working to complete it. You did all this for me, built a future for me, and I've been so scared of losing myself that I couldn't see you've been trying to give me more of myself all along. I wasn't going to pressure you, Marshall said quietly. I wanted you to see it finished, to see what our life could look like, and then make your choice freely, without feeling rushed or obligated. When were you planning to show me? Next week, if the weather holds. There's still finishing work to do, but the structure is sound. The doorways are tall, the ceilings are high, the kitchen is built for someone your height. Every room designed for people like us who've spent our whole lives in spaces too small. Marshall's voice dropped. I wanted to give you a place where you never have to shrink again. Helena looked at the house, really looked at it. At the care evident in every detail, the thought behind every design choice. This wasn't just a house, it was a declaration. Marshall Drake had built her a home before she'd agreed to be his wife, had created something beautiful and spacious and exactly right, and had trusted that eventually she'd be ready to accept it. "Can I see inside?" Helena asked. Marshall's face brightened. He led her up the porch steps and through that impossibly tall door. The interior took Helena's breath away. The great room soared above them, its ceiling a full 12 feet high. Massive timber beams crossed overhead, structural and beautiful. Windows on 3 sides filled the space with light. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, large enough to heat the entire main floor. The kitchen occupied the back corner, and Helena's eyes filled with tears when she saw it. Counters built 36 inches high instead of the standard 32, tall enough that she wouldn't have to bend constantly while working. A stove positioned for someone with her reach. Cabinets hung at heights that made sense for tall arms. "There's 3 bedrooms upstairs," Marshall said, hovering anxiously as Helena explored. "I thought, well, I hoped we might want a family someday, but I didn't want to assume. The largest bedroom has space for a sewing area if you'd rather use it for that. And there's a room on the main floor that could be a proper shop if you wanted to expand your business. Or it could be an office, or... Helena, are you crying?" She was. Tears streamed down her face as she stood in this kitchen, built exactly to her measure, in this house designed for someone her size, and felt something finally settle into place inside her chest. "You built me a home," Helena whispered. "Not just a house. A home where I fit." Marshall crossed to her, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "I wanted you to have a place where you never feel too tall, where every doorway welcomes you instead of challenging you, where you can stand at your full height and know you're exactly where you belong." "Marshall Drake," Helena said, looking up at this man who'd seen her completely and loved her anyway. "I spent my whole life waiting for someone to accept me despite my height. But you see my height as part of what makes me wonderful. You built me a house with tall doors and high ceilings, and you never once asked me to be anything other than exactly what I am." "Because you're perfect exactly as you are," Marshall said simply. "I'm not perfect. I'm stubborn and proud and so terrified of being hurt again that I almost miss the best thing that's ever happened to me." Helena reached up to cup his face, this giant of a man who'd been patient enough to wait for her fear to subside. "But I'm not afraid anymore, or maybe I am, but I'm choosing you anyway. Choosing us. Choosing this future you've built." "Helena," Marshall's voice was rough. "Ask me," Helena said. "Ask me what you've been carrying that ring around to ask me." Marshall reached into his pocket with trembling hands and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a simple gold band with a small diamond, modest, old-fashioned, clearly precious beyond its monetary value. "My mother gave me this before she died," Marshall said. "Made me promise I'd only give it to a woman who was strong enough to stand beside me, not behind me. Someone who knew her own mind and her own worth. Someone who'd be my partner, not my dependent." He took Helena's hand, the ring poised, but not yet offered. "Helena Crowell, will you marry me? Will you make a life with me in this house we'll fill with tall children and laughter? Will you let me spend the rest of my days making sure you always have a place built exactly to your measure?" "Yes," Helena said, and felt the word release something that had been clenched tight inside her since the moment she'd stepped off that train. "Yes, I'll marry you. Yes to the house and the partnership and the future. Yes to all of it." Marshall slid the ring onto her finger, and of course it fit perfectly, because this man who'd built her a house with tall doorways had also taken the time to learn her exact measurements for everything that mattered. Then he kissed her, and Helena felt herself lifted, actually lifted off her feet, by someone strong enough to support her weight, tall enough that the gesture wasn't awkward or strange, but perfectly natural. When he set her down, they were both laughing and crying at once. Through the windows, Helena could see the work crews had stopped to watch, and now they were cheering and applauding. Marshall waved at them, and several men whistled and catcalled with good-natured ribbing. "They knew," Helena said. "They all knew what you were building this for." "Every man on my crew knows I'm in love with you," Marshall confirmed. "Have known since the day I saw you on that platform. They've been taking bets on when you'd finally say yes." "What were the odds?" "Robert Chen bet on February. He's going to win 3 months' worth of tobacco from the others." Marshall grinned. He said any woman smart enough to build a business from nothing would be smart enough to accept a good man when she found one. Helena laughed, the sound echoing in the empty house. Her house. Her home. She spun in a slow circle, taking it all in. The high ceilings, the tall windows, the space designed specifically for people who'd spent their lives being too large for the world they inhabited. When can we move in? Helena asked. 2 weeks? Maybe 3? There's still finishing work, trim to install, floors to seal, a few minor details, but the structure is sound and the basics are complete. Marshall pulled her close again, and Helena marveled at how perfectly she fit against his chest. We should probably wait until after the wedding to actually live here together, given that the whole town will be watching. Then we should get married soon, Helena said. I've waited long enough. They spent the rest of the afternoon in the house, Marshall showing Helena every detail he'd included specifically for her. The bedroom closet with high rods for her dresses, the mudroom with hooks positioned for someone her height, the sitting room window seat built extra long so she could stretch out fully. Every room held evidence of his attention, his care, his absolute commitment to building her a place where she belonged. As the sun began to set, Marshall walked Helena back down to town. News of their engagement spread before they'd even reached Main Street. Someone from the work crew had rushed ahead to share it, and by the time they arrived at the boarding house, people were pouring out to congratulate them. Marjorie hugged Helena so hard she lifted her off her feet, despite being a foot shorter. About time. I was beginning to think you'd never stop overthinking things. Mrs. Talbot kissed both of Helena's cheeks. A spring wedding, I hope. I've always thought spring weddings are the most beautiful. Robert Chen shook Marshall's hand and collected his winnings from grumbling crew members with a satisfied grin. Thomas Garrett promised to give Helena a substantial discount on any wedding dress fabric she needed. The mayor's wife offered to host the reception at her home. Through it all, Helena kept touching the ring on her finger, making sure it was real. Making sure this wasn't a dream she'd wake from to find herself back in Philadelphia, alone and invisible. But it was real. The ring was real. The house was real. Marshall's hand steady at her back was real. And for the first time since stepping off that train 4 months ago, Helena felt like she'd finally arrived at the destination she'd been seeking all along. That night, alone in her boarding house room, Helena sat at her work table but didn't sew. Instead, she pulled out the letters Eamon Pike had written her, the promises that had brought her here, the lies that had nearly broken her. She read through them one final time, seeing them now with different eyes. These letters had been from a man who wanted someone to fit into his life, someone who wouldn't challenge or change or demand anything of him, someone small enough to make him feel big. Marshall's house was the opposite of Pike's letters. It was built to accommodate, to celebrate, to expand. It made room for Helena's height, her business, her dreams. It made room for the person she was, instead of demanding she shrink into someone easier to manage. Helena built a small fire in the pot-bellied stove and fed Pike's letters to it one by one, watching them curl and blacken and turn to ash. She didn't need them anymore. Didn't need the reminder of how low she'd fallen or how much she'd been willing to accept just to avoid being alone. She had something better now, something real and solid and built exactly to her measure. The next morning, Helena reopened her shop to find a line of customers waiting. Word of her engagement had spread, and apparently everyone in Northlake wanted to be part of the preparations. Women needed dresses altered for the wedding. Men wanted new shirts for the celebration. Children needed Sunday clothes mended. Thomas Garrett sent over an order for 20 aprons. His store couldn't keep Helena's products in stock, and he wanted a substantial inventory for the spring rush. Helena threw herself into the work with renewed energy. She had a wedding to pay for, a household to help furnish, a life to build. The Singer sewing machine would arrive in April, Thomas Garrett had confirmed, which meant she'd have professional equipment right when she needed it most. Marshall visited every evening, usually covered in sawdust and exhausted from the push to complete the house. They'd set a date, the first Saturday in April, as soon as the house was finished and the spring weather stabilized enough to guarantee guests could attend. It gave them 6 weeks to prepare, which Helena filled with sewing and planning and occasionally just sitting with Marshall in comfortable silence while they each worked on their respective projects. "I've been thinking," Marshall said one evening while Helena hemmed a dress, and he carved yet another pine cone, About your business after we're married. Helena's hands stilled. What about it? I don't want you to give it up. I know some men expect their wives to stop working once they marry, but that's not what I want for us. Marshall set down his knife, meeting her eyes seriously. Your seamstress work makes you happy. It's something you built yourself, something you're proud of. I want you to keep building it, expanding it if you want. That room on the main floor, I built it with high windows for good light, specifically thinking it could be your professional workspace. Relief flooded through Helena. She hadn't realized she'd been holding that fear, that marriage would mean giving up the independence she'd fought so hard to establish. You really mean that? I really mean it. I'm not marrying you to make you smaller, Helena. I'm marrying you because I love everything about you, including your ambition and your skill and your determination to build something that's yours. Marshall smiled. Besides, I've got expansion plans of my own. Drake Timber is about to take on some major contracts in the northern forests. I'm going to need a wife who understands what it means to build an enterprise from nothing, who won't resent the long hours and hard work. We'll be partners in every sense of the word. They talked late into the night about their plans. Marshall's vision for expanding his timber operation, Helena's dreams of eventually opening a proper shop on Main Street with employees and a full inventory of fabrics. They talked about the possibility of children, about what it would mean to raise tall sons and daughters in a world that often demanded smallness. They talked about building something together that was bigger than either of them could achieve alone. When Marshall finally left, Helena stood at her window and looked up toward the ridge where her future home stood waiting. In 6 weeks, she'd walk into that house as Marshall's wife. She'd fill its rooms with her belongings, her work, her life. She'd wake up every morning in a place built exactly to her measure and go to sleep every night beside someone who thought her height was wonderful. Eamon Pike had rejected her on a train platform because she'd been too tall for his pride. But Marshall Drake had built her a house with 7-foot doorways because he understood that some people were meant to stand tall, and the world needed to make room for them. Helena touched the ring on her finger and smiled. In 6 weeks, she'd have a new name, a new home, and a new life. But she'd still be Helena, still tall, still strong, still refusing to shrink for anyone's comfort. Only now she'd have someone tall enough to stand beside her while she did it. The 6 weeks before the wedding passed in a whirlwind of preparation and transformation. Spring arrived with sudden intensity, melting the last of the snow and turning North Lake streets into rivers of mud. But with the thaw came the Singer sewing machine, arriving on a freight wagon from Seattle in its massive wooden crate like a promise fulfilled. Marshall and 2 of his strongest workers hauled it up to Helena's room at the boarding house, where she unpacked it with trembling hands. The machine was beautiful, black enamel decorated with gold scrollwork, its mechanisms precisely engineered, its presser foot waiting for fabric. Helena had sewn by hand her entire life, every stitch an individual effort of will. Now she had a machine that could sew a straight seam faster than she could think. It's magnificent, Marjorie said, watching Helena run her fingers over the machine's smooth surface. You've earned this, you know, every penny of it through your own hard work. Helena thought about the woman who'd stepped off the train 5 months ago with $17 and a trunk full of desperate hope. That woman would never have imagined owning professional equipment, building a thriving business, preparing to marry a man who'd literally built her a home. The distance between that woman and who Helena had become felt vast as an ocean. I did earn it, Helena agreed, and felt the truth of it settle into her bones. Not arrogance, just recognition. She'd built something real through skill and determination and refusing to give up when everything seemed impossible. The wedding dress came together on that Singer machine, and Helena poured everything she knew into making it perfect. She'd chosen ivory silk, expensive, but she'd saved enough to afford it, and designed something that would accommodate her height while celebrating it. A fitted bodice with a natural waistline that wouldn't try to shorten her torso. Long sleeves that would actually reach her wrists. A skirt that fell to her ankles instead of stopping awkwardly mid-calf like so many ready-made dresses did. She'd added delicate embroidery at the neckline and cuffs, tiny pine cones stitched in gold thread as a private acknowledgement of Marshall's carved gifts that still lined her windowsill. Mrs. Talbot came for a fitting and burst into tears at the sight of Helena in the half-finished dress. "You look like a queen," the schoolteacher said. tall and proud, and absolutely magnificent. Helena studied herself in the small mirror Marjorie had loaned her, turning to see how the silk caught the light. For the first time in her life, she didn't see someone too tall. She just saw Helena, exactly the right size for the life she was building. The house on the ridge was completed 3 weeks before the wedding. Marshall took Helena up to see it on a Sunday afternoon when the spring sun was warm enough to melt the last patches of snow. The crews had finished every detail. Floors sealed and gleaming, walls painted in warm creams and soft blues, windows hung with simple curtains that would let in light while providing privacy. The furniture was minimal but well made, most of it built by Marshall himself during the long winter evenings. Beds with extra-long frames, chairs with tall backs, a dining table with the legs extended to comfortable height. But it was the kitchen that made Helena cry again. Marshall had installed not just tall counters, but also racks for her pots and pans hung at the perfect height for her reach. He'd built in a corner workspace with good light and a sturdy table. For when you want to sew at home instead of at your shop, he'd explained. He'd thought of everything, anticipated every need, created a space where Helena could move through her days without the constant small accommodations tall people made in a world built too small. "This is ours," Helena whispered, standing in the great room with its soaring ceiling and massive windows. "This is really ours." "This is yours," Marshall corrected gently. "I built it for you. Everything else we'll build together." They walked through the house hand in hand, Marshall pointing out details Helena hadn't noticed. The wide stairs built with tall risers, the deep closets that could accommodate Helena's long dresses, the mudroom with space for their oversized boots and coats. Upstairs, the master bedroom held a bed frame Marshall had crafted himself, its posts carved with climbing vines and pine cones. The other bedrooms waited empty, patient for whatever future they would hold. "I've been thinking about names," Marshall said as they stood at the bedroom window looking down at North Lake spread below them. "If we have children, I mean. Tall children who'll need to know their height is something to be proud of, not something to hide." Helena leaned against his shoulder. "What names were you thinking?" "For a girl, maybe Grace. So she'll grow up knowing that tall women move through the world with grace, not clumsiness." Marshall's arm tightened around her waist. "For a boy, maybe Samuel. It means God has heard, because I prayed for years for someone to share this life with, and then you stepped off that train." "Grace and Samuel Drake," Helena tested the names. "They sound like children who'll stand tall." "They'll have no choice with us as parents," Marshall said with a smile. "But at least they'll have a home where all the doorways fit." The wedding preparations consumed North Lake in those final weeks. It wasn't just Helena and Marshall getting married. It was the town celebrating its own success story. The mail-order bride who'd been rejected and stayed anyway. The timber baron who'd built a house for a tall woman before he'd even met her. It was a romance that appealed to everyone's sense of justice and possibility. Mrs. Talbot organized the church decorations, recruiting students to gather wildflowers and pine boughs. Thomas Garrett donated ribbons and fabric for the pews. The mayor's wife opened her home for the reception despite her house being smaller than ideal. "We'll spill into the yard if needed," she'd declared. "Spring weather is perfect for an outdoor celebration." Marjorie insisted on baking the wedding cake herself, a towering 3-layer creation that she'd been planning since the engagement was announced. Robert Chen's crew built a dance floor in the church courtyard. The town's small band began practicing waltzes and reels. But it was 3 days before the wedding when Helena received a letter that threatened to shatter her carefully built peace. It arrived at the boarding house in an envelope with a Port Clement postmark, addressed in handwriting. Helena recognized immediately. Eamon Pike. Her hand shook as she opened it. Why was he writing to her now, after months of silence? What could he possibly have to say? The letter was short, written in Pike's elegant script that had once seemed so promising. "Miss Crowell, I understand you are to be married to Marshall Drake. I write not to congratulate you, but to warn you. Drake is not the man you think he is. His business practices are questionable at best, illegal at worst. He's been buying timber rights from settlers who don't understand the contracts they're signing, exploiting men desperate for quick cash. His timber empire is built on the backs of men he's cheated. I thought you should know the truth about the man you're planning to marry before you make a terrible mistake. This is my final act of charity toward you, warning you away from a man who will ultimately disappoint you as surely as I did, though for different reasons. E. Pike. Helena read the letter 3 times, feeling her stomach twist with each reading. It couldn't be true. Marshall was honest, honorable, fair in all his dealings. Everyone in Northlake respected him, trusted him. But Pike's words wormed into her mind like poison. What if there was truth here? What if she was making another terrible mistake? She took the letter to Marjorie, who read it with a deepening scowl. "That bastard," Marjorie said flatly. "He can't stand that you're happy, so he's trying to poison your wedding with lies." But what if they're not lies? Helena's voice was small. What if I don't know Marshall as well as I think I do? Helena Crowell, you listen to me. Marjorie grabbed Helena's shoulders, forcing eye contact. I've lived in this town for 15 years. I've watched Marshall Drake build his business from nothing after his father died and left him with debts that would have crushed most men. I've seen him deal fairly with every worker, every contract, every transaction. When the mill had that accident 2 years ago and 3 men were injured, Drake paid their medical bills and their wages while they recovered, even though he had no legal obligation to do so. When old Mrs. Chen lost her husband and couldn't afford to keep her boarding house, Drake bought it from her for twice what it was worth so she could retire with dignity. Marjorie released Helena's shoulders but kept her gaze. Pike is a liar and a cheat who's projecting his own sins onto a better man. But if you don't believe me, go ask Drake about it. Ask him directly about these accusations, and then you watch his face when he answers, and you decide for yourself whether you're marrying an honest man or a charlatan. Helena found Marshall at the mill yard that afternoon, reviewing lumber shipments with Robert Chen. He saw her approaching and immediately excused himself, concern crossing his face at whatever he saw in her expression. "Helena? What's wrong?" She handed him the letter without preamble. Marshall read it, his jaw tightening with each line, and when he finished, he crumpled it in one massive fist. "Pike is poison," Marshall said flatly. "He's been spreading these lies in Port Clement, trying to damage my business relationships there. I should have warned you he might try something before the wedding." "So it's not true?" Helena needed to hear him say it. "You're not cheating settlers out of their timber rights?" "No." Marshall's voice was firm. "Every contract I sign, I have a lawyer review it first. I pay fair market rates, usually above market rates because I'd rather have willing partners than resentful ones. And I've never bought timber rights from anyone who didn't fully understand what they were selling." He paused. "Would you like to see the contracts? I keep copies of everything at my office. You can review every transaction if it would ease your mind." "I don't need to see them," Helena said quietly. "I just needed to hear you say it, to look at your face while you said it." "And what does my face tell you?" Helena studied him, this man who'd defended her honor, built her a home, carved her pine cones, and waited patiently for her to be ready to accept his love. She thought about Marjorie's stories of his generosity, about the way his workers spoke of him with respect rather than fear, about the town's unanimous support of their marriage. "Your face tells me Pike is desperate and vindictive and trying to hurt me one last time before I'm beyond his reach," Helena said. "Your face tells me I'm marrying an honest man." Marshall pulled her into his arms, the crumpled letter still in his fist. "Pike can't stand that you chose someone better than him, that you built a life he tried to prevent you from having. This letter is his final attempt to take that away from you." "He failed," Helena said into Marshall's chest. "I'm not the woman I was when I stepped off that train. I don't break as easily anymore." That night, Helena burned Pike's letter in the pot-bellied stove, watching it blacken and curl, just as she'd burned his earlier letters months ago. This was truly the last of him, the final thread connecting her to that moment of rejection on the platform. After Saturday, she'd be Helena Drake, and Eamon Pike would be nothing but an unpleasant memory that had inadvertently led her somewhere better. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and warm, spring fully established and eager to celebrate. Helena woke before sunrise, too nervous to sleep, and found Marjorie already in the kitchen making coffee. "Couldn't sleep either," Marjorie admitted. "Wanted to make sure everything was perfect for you." Mrs. Talbot arrived at 7 to help Helena dress, bringing the mayor's wife and Robert Chen's wife with her. They turned Helena's small room into a flurry of activity, pressing the silk dress one final time, arranging Helena's hair into an elegant style that added inches to her already impressive height, pinning the small veil that Helena had made from leftover silk. When Helena finally stood before the mirror in her completed wedding dress, the other women fell silent. "You look like you could command armies," Mrs. Talbot said softly, "tall and proud and absolutely unshakable." Helena studied her reflection. The dress fit perfectly, emphasizing her height rather than trying to minimize it. Her hair crowned her head regally. Her face showed confidence she'd earned through 5 months of building a life on her own terms. She looked like a woman who knew her own worth, who'd faced down rejection and vindictiveness and fear and emerged stronger. She looked like someone ready to stand beside Marshall Drake and build something magnificent. The church was packed when Helena arrived. Every seat filled, people standing in the back, the doors propped open so those outside could hear. Northlake had turned out in full force to witness this wedding, and as Helena stood in the church's small antechamber, listening to the music start, she felt the weight of their collective goodwill. "Ready?" Marjorie asked. She'd volunteered to walk Helena down the aisle since Helena had no family present. "Or do you need another moment?" "I'm ready," Helena said. "I've been ready for this since Marshall showed me that house with its 7-foot doorways." The music swelled, a traditional wedding march played by the town's small band with more enthusiasm than skill. The congregation stood, and Helena stepped through the doorway into the church, Marjorie at her side, her head high and her spine straight. Marshall stood at the altar in his best suit, and Helena's breath caught at the sight of him. He looked terrified and joyful in equal measure, his hands clasped tight as he watched her approach. Beside him, Robert Chen served as best man, grinning broadly. Helena walked down the aisle past row after row of faces she'd come to know. Thomas Garrett and his wife, Samuel Hendricks and the other timber workers, the mayor and his wife, the town clerk who'd warned her about Pike's machinations, Mrs. Chen and her children, faces that had watched her arrive as a rejected mail-order bride and now witnessed her marriage to the most successful businessman in Northlake. She reached the altar, and Marjorie stepped back with tears in her eyes. Marshall took Helena's hands, his grip strong and steady, and they turned together to face the minister. Pastor Walsh was an elderly man who'd married half of Northlake over his 30-year tenure. He smiled at Helena and Marshall, these two tall people who finally had each other, and began the ceremony. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of Marshall Drake and Helena Crowell. Marriage is a sacred bond, a partnership built on mutual respect and love. Marshall and Helena have chosen to make this commitment publicly, before God and this community, as a testament to their dedication to one another." Helena barely heard the traditional words. She was too focused on Marshall's face, on the way he looked at her like she was something precious and powerful at once, on the way his hands held hers with a gentleness that belied his size, on the certainty in his expression that this, her, was everything he'd been waiting for. "Marshall Drake, do you take Helena Crowell to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, as long as you both shall live?" "I do." Marshall's voice rang through the church, loud and sure. "Helena Crowell, do you take Marshall Drake to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, as long as you both shall live?" Helena thought about the journey that had brought her here, the train platform rejection, the boarding house room where she'd decided to stay, the courtroom where she'd defended her right to exist in this town, the countless hours of sewing, building a business stitch by stitch, the house on the ridge with its tall doorways and high ceilings, every moment of fear and determination and slow-growing love that had led to this instant. "I do," Helena said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. "The rings, please." Robert Chen produced 2 gold bands. Marshall's was wider, Helena's more delicate, but both made to match. Marshall took Helena's ring with slightly trembling hands and slid it onto her finger where it joined his mother's engagement ring. "With this ring, I thee wed," Marshall said, "and I promise to spend every day making sure you have a place built exactly to your measure." Helena took Marshall's ring and slid it onto his finger, marveling at the size of his hands, the strength in them. "With this ring, I thee wed, she said, and I promise to stand beside you at my full height, never shrinking, never apologizing for the space we take up together. Pastor Walsh beamed. By the power vested in me by the territory and by God, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Marshall, you may kiss your bride. Marshall cupped Helena's face in his enormous hands and kissed her thoroughly while the church erupted in applause and cheers. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and grinning, Pastor Walsh raised his hands for quiet. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Mr. and Mrs. Marshall Drake. They walked back down the aisle together, Helena's hand tucked into Marshall's arm, past rows of smiling faces and into the spring sunshine. Outside, the church courtyard had been transformed. Tables laden with food lined the space. The dance floor Robert Chen's crew had built gleamed in the sunlight. Ribbons and wildflowers decorated everything. And there, at the edge of the courtyard, stood the most unexpected sight. A wagon decorated with pine boughs and ribbons, pulled by two massive draft horses, clearly meant to carry the bride and groom to their new home on the ridge. When did you arrange this? Helena asked Marshall. I didn't. The crew did it as a surprise. Marshall waved to the timber workers who'd assembled near the wagon, all of them grinning. They wanted to make sure we arrived at our home in style. The reception was everything a frontier wedding should be. Abundant food, flowing cider, music that kept people dancing until their feet hurt. Marjorie's cake was a triumph, tall and elegant and delicious. Thomas Garrett gave a toast about how Helena had brought civilization to Northlake one repaired shirt at a time. Mrs. Talbot read a poem she'd written about tall trees and tall people and roots that run deep. Robert Chen told an embarrassing story about Marshall spending an entire timber crew meeting distracted by thoughts of Helena after their first dance. As the afternoon wore into evening, Marshall led Helena onto the dance floor for their first dance as husband and wife. The band played a waltz, the same song they danced to at the town social 5 months ago when Marshall had first made his intentions clear. I keep thinking about that train platform, Helena said as they turned across the floor. About standing there being rejected, feeling like I'd made the biggest mistake of my life coming here. And now? Marshall asked. Now I know it was the best thing that ever happened to me. Pike's rejection freed me to find you, to build something real instead of accepting something false. Helena looked up at her husband, and smiled. He tried to diminish me, but instead he gave me room to grow. They danced 3 more dances, then Marshall announced it was time to leave for their home. The crowd cheered as they climbed into the decorated wagon. Marshall took the reins and the horses pulled them through Northlake streets toward the ridge trail. People lined the route, waving and calling congratulations. Children ran alongside the wagon until their mothers called them back. And Helena sat beside Marshall, her husband, wearing a wedding dress she'd made herself with a machine she'd purchased with money she'd earned, heading toward a home built exactly to her measure. The wagon couldn't navigate the full trail to the ridge, so they left it at the trailhead and walked the last section hand in hand as the sun began to set. The house stood waiting for them, its windows golden with lamplight. Someone from the crew had gone ahead to light lamps and start a fire in the great hearth, ensuring the house would be warm and welcoming when they arrived. Marshall swept Helena into his arms at the threshold, carrying her over it despite her height making the gesture somewhat awkward, and set her down gently in their home. Their home. Helena stood in the great room and felt 5 months of struggle and triumph settle into something like peace. She'd traveled 3,000 miles to this frontier town believing she needed someone to save her, to give her a place in the world. Instead, she'd discovered she could save herself, build her own place, and then choose to share it with someone who saw her completely and loved her anyway. "Welcome home, Mrs. Drake," Marshall said, pulling her close. "Welcome home yourself, Mr. Drake," Helena replied, and kissed her husband in the house built tall enough to fit them both. That night they sat on the porch and looked down at Northlake spread below them, a frontier town built on timber and determination, full of people who'd accepted a rejected mail-order bride and watched her become one of their own. Lamplight glowed in windows, smoke rose from chimneys. Somewhere down there, the boarding house where Helena had spent 5 months building her business still stood. The church where they'd married this morning, the mill where Marshall's empire operated, the general store where Helena's aprons sold out as fast as Thomas Garrett could stock them. I've been thinking about expanding the business, Helena said, nestled against Marshall's shoulder. Really expanding. Maybe opening that shop on Main Street we talked about. Hiring assistants, offering more than just mending, maybe making ready-made dresses for tall women who have the same problems I always had, finding clothes that fit. There's a building for sale next to Garrett's store, Marshall said. Good location, solid structure. I could help you negotiate the purchase. I want to do it myself, Helena said, but I'd appreciate your advice. Partners, Marshall agreed, in everything. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Helena thought about the carved pine cones that lined her windowsill, about the Singer sewing machine that would be moved to this house tomorrow, about the tall doorways and high ceilings and kitchen counters built exactly right. She thought about Grace and Samuel, the tall children who might someday fill these empty bedrooms. She thought about growing old in this house with this man, building a life neither of them had to shrink to fit into. Marshall, Helena said softly, thank you for seeing me, for really seeing me when everyone else just saw someone too tall. Helena, Marshall replied, you were never too tall. The world was just too small. All I did was build something big enough to fit you properly. Helena stood, pulling Marshall up with her, and they walked inside their home together, through doorways built tall enough to welcome them, into rooms with ceilings high enough to never make them feel confined, into a future they'd build together, standing at their full height, taking up exactly as much space as they deserved. The rejected mail-order bride had found her place, not by making herself smaller, but by refusing to shrink until she found someone who understood that tall things, tall trees, tall people, tall dreams, weren't flaws to be hidden. They were wonders to be celebrated. And in a house on a ridge above a frontier logging town, Helena Crowell Drake finally stopped apologizing for the space she took up. She was home. She was